the claimant Queen Rhaenyra during the Targaryen civil war. That small act of generosity then caused unrest, as it will now. When the people see that while the Lannisters would starve them for a party, their true queen offers them sustenance, it will ignite a rebellion, Daenerys murmured, piecing it together. And Tywin will have no choice but to abandon the north to restore order in the capital. Yes, Tyrion confirmed. But the riots will also complicate your claim to the throne, your grace. Tywin's return will draw more focus to the crown's stability, or lack thereof. Daenerys tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp. And you expect me to sacrifice my campaign for the Sake of the North? Rosalind stepped forward, her tone firm but respectful. Your grace, with all due respect, if the dead take the North, the South will fall next. They will keep coming until there's nothing left but ice and death. If we do not stand together now, there will be no Iron Throne to claim, only ashes. For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of Rosalind's words sinking into the cold air. Daenerys leaned back slightly, her lips pressing into a firm line as she weighed the gravity of the choice before her. Daenerys rose from her throne, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Her expression was resolute, her voice steady with authority as she gave her command. Do it, she said decisively, her gaze sweeping over her advisors and guests. Missandei, ensure our guests are provided with suitable accommodations. They are to be treated with every courtesy. Missandei inclined her head gracefully, already making mental notes to see the arrangements through. Grey Worm, Daenerys continued, turning her attention to her loyal commander. Prepare the Unsullied and Dothraki to move. I want every man ready for deployment. As soon as Tywin Lannister sets foot back on southern soil, we march north. Her words were a declaration, a vow not just to her allies but to herself. The room was still as the magnitude of her decision settled over them all. There was no turning back now, the course was set. Chapter 65, Cersei v. Chapter text. Cersei v. In the month since the twins had been born, Cersei felt her life slipping further and further from her grasp. Their arrival had been heralded as a new era for House Baratheon, but for Cersei, it had been the final nail in the coffin that had slowly formed around her. She had been pushed into the shadowy confines of a role she detested, categorized now as a grandmother, no longer the fierce and commanding queen who had once sat beside a powerful king. She wasn't the glittering jewel of King's Landing anymore, the woman who held court with a single raised eyebrow. Instead, she was a widow, sidelined and slowly being forgotten, watching helplessly as her son, the embodiment of Lannister power and beauty, doted on his wife and children. She could no longer see her own reflection in Tommen. Once, he had come to her for guidance, for reassurance, for protection. She had been his rock, his fortress, his confidant. Now, that role had shifted to Margaery, with her radiant smile, her youthful glow, and her seemingly endless energy for playing the perfect queen and mother. Tommen no longer sought his mother's wisdom, nor her comfort. She wasn't his safe haven anymore, and the realization stung more than she cared to admit. Cersei had tried to fight the decay of her image. She'd commissioned lavish new gowns, each one more elaborate than the last, in Lannister crimson and gold. She'd summoned hairstylists from Essos, demanding intricate braids and coils, adorned with jewels that sparkled like wildfire. Yet no matter how much effort she poured into her appearance, it always seemed futile. Margaery still outshone her at every turn. Her skin was flawless, with a natural blush that made her look untouched by the hardships of the world. Her hair fell in perfect waves, needing no jewels or artifice to draw the eye. She was everything Cersei could no longer pretend to be. Sometimes, late at night, Cersei allowed herself to wonder what her life might have been like if she'd accepted her father's will and married Willers Tyrell all those years ago. As Lady of Highgarden, she would have commanded a powerful seat in the Reach, surrounded by wealth, influence, and respect. She would have ruled as fiercely as Olenna, wielding power in a way she could never do now as a dowager queen. Instead, she was here, a widow clinging to the fading echoes of her once lofty status, haunting the halls of a castle she no longer ruled. The only glimmer of solace in her increasingly empty days came from the twins. She loved them as fiercely as she had her own children, with that same protective, consuming devotion. Late at night, when the nursery was quiet and Margaery had long retired to her own chambers, Cersei would slip inside and watch them sleep. Their small chests rose and fell in peaceful rhythm, their faces so perfect, untouched by the burdens of their heritage. In those moments, she felt a fragile thread of hope, a sense of purpose, however fleeting. She imagined what their lives could be, the people they might grow into. But the thoughts often darkened. Margaery would raise them as Baratheons, of course. They wouldn't be Lannisters. They wouldn't bear the name, nor carry the Lion's legacy as they should. They'd be raised under Robert's shadow, as if they owed their place in this world to him. The idea filled her with a cold fury. These children were hers, as much as Tommen's or Margaery's. They were the future of her bloodline, and she would not see them stripped of that. Sometimes, in the quiet of the nursery, Cersei entertained wild thoughts. She pictured Jaime returning from the north, the two of them slipping away with the twins in the dead of night. They could take a ship east, far away from King's Landing and its suffocating politics, and raise the twins as they should have raised their own children. No Baratheons. No thrones. Just them, a family bound by blood and love. But as quickly as the thought came, it vanished. Cersei knew she could never run. She was the daughter of Tywin Lannister, forged in the fires of the Rock itself. She was not made for obscurity. She would rather burn the city to the ground than fade into irrelevance. Cersei knew that today, the day of the twins' presentation to the city, was her final opportunity to reclaim her grip on the people, the crown, and, most importantly, Tommen. It had to be perfect. She had poured weeks of effort into crafting a celebration that would be etched into history, a display of Lannister power and glory. Ornate carriages pulled by the finest white horses had been commissioned. Bespoke outfits for the royal family, in shades of crimson and gold, had been designed to reflect the might of House Lannister. There would be fire breathers, jugglers, and musicians performing at every turn, their costumes adorned with golden lion headpieces. A grand feast was to be held in the keep, with wagons of wine brought directly from the Rock to remind the people of the wealth and splendor of their rulers. Yet, at every step, her vision had been chipped away, whittled down by the ever-scheming Queen Margaery. Cersei had barely contained her rage when she learned that the carefully designed outfits for the royal family had been altered. Instead of red and gold, Margaery had ordered garments in black and yellow, the colors of House Baratheon. Her fire-breathers, intended to wear lion headpieces to honor the Lannister legacy, now donned stag antlers. Even the wine from Casterly Rock, a reminder of Lannister superiority, had been rejected in favor of Arbor Gold, the pride of the Tyrells. Every change felt like a slight, a deliberate undermining of her authority. This was supposed to be a day for her family, her house, and yet Margaery, with her doe-eyed smiles and insipid charm, had made it all about her own. Cersei had tried to push back, but Tommen had sided with Margaery every time. "She's just trying to honor father's memory," he had said when Cersei had protested. "The black and yellow garments, we are House Baratheon after all." "The people love the Arbor's wine," he had added when she raged about the shipments from the Rock being refused. Robert's memory. Cersei nearly laughed aloud at the thought. The stag whose crown she had taken, whose children she had replaced with her own golden lions. The people might have adored him once, but his true legacy, the one that mattered, was Tommen, the last of her sons. And now even Tommen was slipping from her grasp, bewitched by Margaery's pretty words and softer touch. Cersei's hands clenched into fists at her sides as she paced the great hall that morning. The day had not yet begun, but already she could feel the control slipping further away. This was supposed to be her triumph, her chance to remind the city who truly held power, but Margaery's influence had turned it into a farce, a parade for her children, her legacy. Still, Cersei refused to surrender. If today was her last chance to reclaim what she had lost, then she would seize it with both hands. No matter what Margaery had planned, no matter what insipid gestures the Tyrell girl had woven into the day's events, Cersei would ensure that the people remembered this as a celebration of House Lannister. She would remind them, and everyone, of her strength, of her power. And, God's willing, she would remind Tommen that his heart, and his loyalty, belonged to his mother, not to his wife. Cersei stood in the Red Keep's courtyard, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. She had spared no expense on her appearance today. Her gown was a masterpiece of Lannister craftsmanship, a deep crimson silk embroidered with golden lions that shimmered with every movement. The neckline was modest but commanding, adorned with a necklace of rubies that caught the sunlight like drops of blood. The dress had been tailored to perfection, designed to remind everyone of her standing as the matriarch of House Lannister. This, at least, was one area where Margaery could not challenge her. Cersei was a Lannister, after all, and no one would dare deny her the right to wear her house's colors. She stood tall, her eyes fixed on the steps of the Great Keep as Tommen and Margaery emerged. The young king and queen were the picture of blissful perfection, each holding one of their infant children swaddled in golden blankets embroidered with the Baratheon sigil. The ornate fabric glittered in the sunlight, a deliberate display of wealth and power. They descended the steps with an air of practiced grace, Tommen glancing at his wife with a soft, boyish smile while Margaery beamed at the crowd beyond the gates. Cersei felt her stomach churn as she watched them climb into the front carriage of the parade. The couple looked every inch the loving parents, the perfect royal family, but to Cersei, it was all a carefully orchestrated performance, a ploy to keep the people's hearts firmly in Margaery's grasp. The sight of her son so enamored with his wife, so utterly enthralled by her, was almost too much to bear. That should have been her place, sitting beside Tommen, guiding him, holding their family together. Instead, she was relegated to the second carriage, forced to share it with those she despised. She lingered in the courtyard, her expression schooled into an icy mask as she awaited her unwanted companions. With Jaime and her father in the north, Myrcella and her daughter returned to Dorne, and Joffrey long dead, there was no family left to accompany her. She was surrounded by strangers in her own home, and today was no exception. Her thoughts were briefly interrupted as she spotted Olenna Tyrell approaching, her stride steady despite her advanced years. The Queen of Thorns was followed by her son, Mace, his ridiculous feathered hat bobbing as he walked, and his wife, Aeleri, who wore her usual placid smile. Cersei's lips thinned as they drew closer. She would have preferred even Tyrion's company to this ordeal. At least with Tyrion, there was the satisfaction of matching wits, the fire of shared venom. With Olenna, there was only the sting of her sharp tongue, cutting deeper than most swords. And as for Mace and Aeleri, Cersei suppressed a sneer. Mace was a blustering fool, a man so desperate to prove himself that he often tripped over his own words. Aeleri, on the other hand, was maddeningly unremarkable, a woman with no fire, no ambition. Cersei couldn't decide which was worse, enduring Olenna's barbs or the dullness of her son and daughter-in-law. Still, she straightened her shoulders, her spine as rigid as steel, and greeted them with a tight-lipped smile as they approached. "Lady Olenna," she said coolly, inclining her head ever so slightly. "Lady Cersei," Olenna replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What a vision you are! I've heard of your father's injuries in the north, I join you in wishing him a quick recovery and return to form." Cersei's smile froze. "And you look as sharp as ever, Lady Olenna," she said, her tone as sweet as honey but with a hint of malice. "My father is strong, his injuries are merely a minor inconvenience." Olenna smirked, clearly unimpressed, before gesturing toward the carriage. "Shall we? I wouldn't want to keep the people waiting." With a curt nod, Cersei stepped toward the carriage, her skirts swishing against the cobblestones. The Tyrells followed, and as the doors closed behind them, Cersei braced herself for the journey ahead. The parade would be long, and the company unbearable, but she would endure it. As the procession wound its way through the streets of King's Landing, the grandeur was undeniable. A parade of at least 10 carriages stretched along the cobbled streets, each one gleaming in the sunlight and flanked by rows of soldiers. The Lannister garrison led the way, their ornate display armor polished to perfection, the lions of their sigils roaring on their crimson and gold surcoats. At the rear, more soldiers rode on horseback, their banners fluttering in the breeze. The clatter of hooves, the rhythmic pounding of boots, and the distant murmur of the crowd all combined into a steady, almost hypnotic hum. Cersei sat back in her carriage, the finest in the procession save for the royal one ahead of her. The seats were upholstered in rich velvet, the curtains thick with golden embroidery, and the Lion of Lannister emblazoned proudly on the doors. She allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction as she envisioned the sight they must present to the city. This was power, this was dominance, and this was the true legacy of House Lannister. She imagined the people craning their necks to catch a glimpse, marveling at the strength and wealth of their rulers. This parade was more than just a celebration of the twins, it was a declaration of Lannister supremacy. When she returned to Tommen's side, truly returned, not as an ornament but as his guide, his protector, his queen mother, this would be the norm. No one would dare question their right to rule. The Lion of Lannister would roar once again, drowning out any whispers of dragons or rebellion. Yet as her gaze flickered to the streets beyond the carriage window, her satisfaction wavered. The faces of the small folk lining the streets were a stark contrast to the splendor of the parade. They were gaunt and sallow, their eyes hollowed by exhaustion and hunger. Children clung to their mothers, their ragged clothes barely protecting them from the chill in the air. Few smiled or cheered as the carriages passed. Most simply stared, their expressions a mixture of apathy and bitterness. Cersea's lips pressed into a thin line as she turned her head away from the window. The sight of them soured her mood. Ungrateful wretches, she thought. She had given them everything, order, protection, the strength of her house, and yet they looked at her with dull, resentful eyes. Did they not understand the cost of greatness? Her father's war in the north, though necessary, had drained the city of its able-bodied men, leaving behind the weak and the useless. The new taxes, imposed to fund the crown's efforts, had been met with complaints and riots. The whispers of discontent had grown louder, no matter how many times the King's Guard had been sent to silence them. She had overheard Loras Tyrell once speaking to Tommen about the disturbances in Flea Bottom, how the King's Guard were breaking up brawls and uprisings almost daily. It was no surprise to Cersei, the small folk had always been little better than animals, needing to be herded and controlled. Their struggles were their own fault, a result of their laziness and lack of foresight. And now, the spectre of Daenerys Targaryen loomed over the city. Her arrival at Dragonstone had reignited the dormant loyalties of fools who longed for the return of the dragon's tyranny. Cersei had always known that King's Landing, despite Robert's best efforts to stamp out every trace of Targaryen rule, had never truly forgotten its former masters. She had felt it in the way the people spoke of the dragons as myths, as if they were creatures of awe rather than destruction. She had seen it in the way they whispered stories of the old Targaryen kings, as if they had been noble rather than mad. The very thought of Daenerys made Cersei's blood boil. That upstart girl, claiming to be a queen, had no idea of the sacrifices it took to hold a throne. She had not endured the years of manipulation, the careful games, the battles waged not with swords but with words. If the people truly believed that Daenerys would save them, they were more foolish than Cersei had ever imagined. The small folk were insignificant, blind to the truth. If they wanted to turn their backs on the strength and stability of the Lannisters and chase after the illusion of the Targaryens, then they deserved to suffer. Cersei's mouth curled into a sneer as she stared straight ahead, her mind steeling itself against the growing tide of discontent. She would remind them of what true power looked like. Today was only the beginning. The courtyard of the Great September awaited, and with it, her final chance to cement her place in this city, in this family. Cersei Lannister was not done yet. The people might have forgotten what it meant to fear the lion, but she would remind them soon enough. As they arrived at the Great September of Baelor, the procession of carriages came to a halt one by one. Footmen rushed to open the doors, and the occupants stepped out onto the grand stone square, their footsteps echoing faintly against the silence of the crowd. Cersei descended from her carriage, the folds of her crimson and gold gown sweeping behind her, her expression composed but her mind racing. The crowd was vast, far larger than she had anticipated. They stretched far beyond the immediate square, spilling into the surrounding streets like a surging tide. Larger than Joffrey or Tommen's coronations, larger than any royal wedding, even her own, and certainly larger than the funerals of Robert or Joffrey. Yet, despite their numbers, the mood was oppressively solemn. Cersei scanned the faces in the crowd, hoping to find some flicker of joy, pride, or even awe. Instead, she was met with dull, sunken eyes and grim expressions. The small folk stood shoulder to shoulder in their rags, some clutching children to their sides, others shifting restlessly as if the mere effort of standing for so long was too much for their frail bodies. The air was thick with the occasional cough, a shuffling of feet, and the murmur of restless whispers. Ahead of her, Tommen and Margaery were already ascending the steps to the September, each holding one of the twins. The High Septon stood at the top of the steps, flanked by Septars and Septons, his arms outstretched in a gesture of welcome. Tommen and Margaery reached him and offered polite bows, presenting the children as the High Septon gave his blessings. Then, as was now their custom, Tommen and Margaery turned to face the crowd. The king and queen raised their hands, waving at the gathered masses, the golden fabric of their garments catching the light. It was a move Margaery had perfected in the early days of her engagement to Joffrey, a calculated gesture designed to connect with the people. But today, it had none of the desired effect. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd remained unmoved, their faces blank and unresponsive. There was no cheer, no applause, no cries of adoration for the royal family. The only sounds were the occasional coughs, the shuffling of weary feet, and the indistinct hum of a city on the brink. Cersea's brow furrowed as a chill ran through her. This was not the reception she had expected, not the reception the Lannisters deserved. "What on earth is happening?" came Mace Tyrell's voice, puffing as he struggled to climb out of the carriage behind her, his face red with exertion. His bejeweled doublet strained against his girth as he adjusted himself. "Let's just get inside," Olenna snapped, brushing past him with an urgency that was unusual for her. Her sharp eyes darted across the crowd, taking in the tension in the air. She clearly understood, as Cersei did, that this was not just indifference, it was a warning. Cersei said nothing, but she felt the weight of Olenna's unspoken conclusion settle heavily in her chest. The people were not here to celebrate. They had come for something else entirely. As she followed the Tyrells towards the steps, Cersei's mind churned. This was supposed to have been her moment, a grand display of Lannister power, a reclaiming of the city's loyalty. Yet, instead of cheers, the silence of the crowd felt like an accusation. Her sharp gaze flickered to Margaery, who was now smiling for the High Septon as if everything was as it should be. "This is your fault," Cersei thought bitterly. Margaery's endless efforts to ingratiate herself with the people had only made their expectations impossible to meet. And now, with the city starving and Daenerys Targaryen looming on the horizon, the small folk had grown restless. As they neared the entrance to the September, Cersei glanced back over her shoulder at the crowd one last time. She spotted a woman clutching a child, the boy's face thin and gaunt, his eyes wide with a mixture of hunger and fear. Beside them, a man stood leaning on a crude crutch, his leg wrapped in filthy bandages. The sight made her sneer. The people were weak, ungrateful for the stability the Lannisters had given them. As the September began to fill with the nobility of King's Landing, their whispered conversations and the shuffling of their ornate robes reverberated faintly off the towering stone walls. Cersei took her place in the pews near the front, forcing herself to maintain her composure, but her thoughts were elsewhere. No matter how hard she tried to focus on the ceremony unfolding before her, her mind remained on the people outside, the silent, watchful crowd that had come not to celebrate but to bear witness. Her surroundings only added to her growing irritation. To her left, Mace Tyrell sat in his ostentatious doublet and his ridiculous plumed hat that swayed with every exaggerated movement he made. To her right was Melaea Caswell, whose garish green and gold dress seemed to consume half the bench, leaving Cersei pressed uncomfortably between the two. She didn't even bother to grimace or remark on the indignity of it, her thoughts were too preoccupied. The High Septon began to speak, his voice echoing through the vast September of Baelor, a solemn and rehearsed cadence that did nothing to calm her nerves. He stepped forward and extended his arms to Margaery, who gracefully handed over the princess swaddled in her golden blanket. "With humble hearts, on this day, we welcome Princess Argella of House Baratheon into our hearts and into the light of the Seven," the High Septon intoned. His voice rose to fill the chamber as he moved through the ceremonial blessings. "May she live a just life, led by the Father. May she have strength gifted by the Smith. May she be brave and forever protected by the warrior. May she have beauty instilled by the maiden. May she know the mercy and peace of the mother. May she have wisdom passed down by the crone. And when her time comes and her days are done, let her go with the stranger as a friend." The princess was handed back to Margaery, who accepted her with a radiant smile that seemed designed to dazzle the onlookers. Cersei watched the exchange with cool disdain, though her mind barely registered it. Her attention was pulled toward the faint murmur of noise filtering in from outside. At first, it was little more than a low hum, a faint disturbance she might have dismissed as the restless shuffle of the crowd gathered beyond the September's doors. But as the High Septon turned to Tommen and extended his arms for the young prince, the noise grew louder, more distinct. Cersei's ears strained to make out the words. Then, suddenly, she caught them. "Whore! Traitor! Bastard!" The words cut through the sacred air of the September like knives. Circe's spine stiffened, and her hand tightened on the armrest of the pew. The High Septon, seemingly unaware, continued his solemn duties. He took Ois from Tommen's arms, holding the boy aloft as he began the same blessings he had just bestowed upon his sister. With humble hearts, on this day, we welcome Prince Ois of House Baratheon, Prince of Dragonstone and heir to the Iron Throne, into our hearts and into the light of the Seven. The words faded into the background for Circe as the shouting outside grew louder, the accusations more vehement. The chants of whore and traitor rose in unison, mingling with the murmurs of discontent. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if the High Septon could hear it too, or if the pious fool was too caught up in his rehearsed sanctimony to notice the chaos brewing just beyond the September's gilded doors. Her eyes flicked to Margaery, who was holding the princess and smiling serenely as if she hadn't noticed the noise. But Circe could see the slight tension in her posture, the way her grip on the child had tightened just a fraction. You hear it too, Circe thought bitterly, and you know this is your fault as much as anyone's. A quick glance at Tommen revealed the boy king looking nervous and confused, his wide eyes darting toward the doors as though he were unsure whether to acknowledge the disturbance or ignore it. Circe's heart clenched. He was too soft for this, too naive to realize that this was not just discontent but danger, a storm brewing that could sweep them all away. Her gaze returned to the High Septon, still obliviously reciting blessings over the prince, and she fought the urge to rise from her seat and demand he speed up the ceremony. Every moment they lingered here, exposed and vulnerable, the crowd outside grew angrier, bolder. Circe's mind raced. Why now? Why today? The answers came unbidden, cruelly logical in their simplicity. The city was starving. The war had drained its resources, and the people had been pushed to their limits. And now, Daenerys Targaryen had landed at Dragonstone, a new queen with dragons and promises of liberation. The people wanted change, and they were willing to believe that the woman with fire and blood in her veins could give it to them. And here she was, sitting in the September, surrounded by sycophants and traitors, powerless to stop the tide that was turning against her family. For the first time in years, Circe felt a flicker of fear. Not for herself, but for Tommen. For her grandchildren. For her legacy. The shouting outside continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was only a matter of time before it reached a breaking point. And Circe knew, deep in her bones, that the city would not be so easily placated this time. As the ceremony drew to a close, the High Septon pronounced his final blessings, and the crowd within the September rose from their seats. The sound of murmured conversations and rustling silk filled the air as guests began to disperse, gravitating towards familiar faces. Circe remained seated for a moment, her eyes fixed on Tommen and Margaery at the center of the gathering. The Tyrells wasted no time surrounding them. Margaery's brothers, Willers and Gullen, flanked the king and queen, their wives joined them, smiling and laughing with an ease that grated against Circe's nerves. Then came Margaery's nephew, who earned a warm laugh from the king with some jest Circe could not hear. The sight was unbearable. Tommen looked so happy, a radiant smile lighting up his boyish features as he basked in the attention of Margaery's family. They made it all seem so effortless, their unity and charm, their tight-knit bonds. Circe's jaw clenched. In another world, this would not have been her son's reality. She allowed herself, briefly, to imagine that alternate world. Tommen would have married someone else, someone quiet and docile. A placid girl from a noble family, one who would speak only when spoken to and would never think to challenge her authority. In that world, her eldest son, Joffrey, would still be king, ruling with all the fire and fury that Robert had lacked. Perhaps he would even have a child of his own by now, a child Circe could mold as she had molded him. Her daughter, sweet Myrcella, would not be in Dorne, a land that had stolen her away and left Circe powerless to bring her home. No, in that world, her family would be whole again, as it was meant to be. But that was not her reality. Joffrey was dead, his young life snuffed out before he could even wear the crown properly. Myrcella had returned to Dorne, the realm of snakes. And here, in the September of Baelor, Tommen smiled at the Tyrells, his affection slipping further and further from her grasp. The bitterness of it all curdled in her chest as she forced herself to rise from her seat. She adjusted her crimson gown and began to move towards her son, determined to draw his attention away from his wife's insufferable family. But before she could take more than a few steps, a guard in Lannister colors approached her, leaning in to whisper urgently in her ear. "We should return to the keep quickly, Your Grace. The crowds are becoming harder to control." Cersea's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at the grand doors of the September, as though she could hear the distant shouts and murmurs beyond them even now. The ceremony had dulled the sound somewhat, but the unrest outside was far from over. If anything, it seemed to have grown louder, more volatile. She nodded, forcing her face into an expression of calm authority. "Of course," she said, her voice low and steady. She could not let the Tyrells see her rattled. "Make the preparations." The guard saluted and stepped away, leaving her to approach Tommen. She moved swiftly but deliberately, her skirts brushing the marble floor with each step. "Tommen," she said, her tone brisk but gentle as she reached him. Her son turned to her, his smile faltering slightly at the look on her face. "We must return to the keep immediately." "But," Tommen began, his gaze flickering to Margaery, who looked equally confused. "There's been a change in plans," Cersei continued, cutting him off before he could argue. "The parade will have to be postponed. The crowds outside are becoming unruly, and it would be unwise to linger here any longer." She didn't wait for his response, instead turning to Margaery. "We'll proceed back to the keep at once." Margaery hesitated, glancing at her brothers and then back at Cersei. "Is it truly so urgent?" she asked, her voice as sweet as honey but edged with skepticism. "It is," Cersei snapped, her patience wearing thin. "If you wish to keep your husband and children safe, you'll do as I say." Margaery's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. She turned to one of her guards and gave the necessary instructions, her usual composure intact despite the tension in the air. As the Tyrells moved to organize themselves, Cersei allowed herself a moment to breathe. The plan had been to walk back to the Red Keep in a grand procession, led by the High Septon himself, so that the city could marvel at the new prince and princess. But now, that plan was in ruins. They would retreat quickly and quietly, slipping through the streets under heavy guard. The tension was palpable as they stepped out into the open air, the heat of the sun stark against the chill of fear that crept down Cersei's spine. At the base of the grand marble steps, the royal carriage waited, its door open and its gold embellishments gleaming as if mocking the grim reality of the moment. The soldiers surrounding it stood at attention, their spears raised in a defensive formation. All they had to do was descend those steps and get inside, and they would be safe, at least for now. But the crowd was different now. The subdued faces they had passed earlier, hollow-eyed and thin from starvation, had transformed into something far more dangerous. Angry shouts reverberated through the air, a cacophony of rage and despair. Cersei strained to make sense of the words, her heart sinking as fragments reached her ears. "Lannister bastard. You were meant to keep us safe. Lying bitch." And then came the chant that froze her blood, the one she had feared above all else. "Long live Queen Daenerys." Cersei's breath caught, her hands clenching at the folds of her dress. Her gaze darted to Tommen, standing just ahead of her. The boy, no, the king, turned his wide eyes to her, and in that moment, he was no longer the ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. He was just a frightened child, looking to his mother for comfort, for answers. She wanted to scream at him to move, to stop standing there like a deer caught in a hunter's snare. But she couldn't. No one could. The group had frozen in place, paralyzed by the noise, by the hostility that radiated from the masses pressing against the barriers. It was Loras who broke the silence. Clad in his gleaming Kingsguard armor, he stepped forward with a commanding presence, his voice steady and resolute. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Tommen with a calm authority that belied the chaos around them. "You need to take the princess and go with your mother in the first carriage." He turned to Margaery, his expression softening only slightly. "Sister, you take the prince and go with mother and father in the second carriage." "No," Tommen said, his voice trembling but defiant. "I don't want to be a part." Loras's jaw tightened, but his tone remained patient. "If anything should happen, Your Grace, you and the prince cannot be together. He is your heir." "If the worst comes to pass," he trailed off, letting the unspoken words hang in the air like a shadow. "I'll go with them," he added, his hand resting firmly on Tommen's shoulder. "And I swear to you, I will keep them safe. As your brother, I give you my word." Tommen hesitated, his young face contorting with emotion. He glanced at Margaery, who gave him a small, encouraging nod, though her own fear was evident in her eyes. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders sagging in reluctant acceptance. Carefully, he handed the swaddled Prince Ois to Margaery and took his daughter, Princess Argella, into his arms. He looked down at the tiny face nestled against his chest, his expression softening for a moment before he lifted his gaze back to his wife. "I love you," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. He leaned forward, kissing her with a fierceness that seemed to surprise her. "I'll see you soon," he added, his words a promise and a plea all at once. Margaery nodded, her composure faltering only slightly as she turned away, cradling Ois. Loras gestured for Tommen to follow, and the young king descended the steps with his daughter in his arms, his movements stiff with unease. Cersei hesitated for only a moment, her eyes meeting Margaery's. There was no need for words between them, the distrust, the resentment, and the unspoken fear were plain enough. Without another glance, Cersei moved quickly to follow her son. As they reached the carriage, the shouts from the crowd seemed to grow louder, more frenzied. Cersei could feel their anger like a physical force pressing against her, threatening to suffocate her. She glanced back towards the September, where Margaery was being ushered into the second carriage with her parents and the prince. The soldiers closed ranks around them, their polished armor gleaming in the sunlight, but even their presence felt inadequate against the tide of unrest. Cersei climbed into the carriage behind Tommen, her mind racing. This was no longer about the twins, the parade, or even the chance for Daenerys. This was about survival. The people of King's Landing, once cowed into submission by the might of House Lannister, were now defiant, their desperation morphing into fury. Their silence had given way to something far more dangerous, a collective rage that surged like wildfire through the crowd. As the carriage lurched forward, the first rock struck the side with a dull thud. Then another, and another. The impact sent vibrations through the ornate structure, and Cersei could hear the clattering of more objects, pots, stones, even what sounded like shards of broken tiles, raining down on the gilded surface. She flinched at a particularly loud crash against the roof, her nails digging into the plush seat beneath her. The city guard stationed at the door reached to pull it closed, but before he could turn away, Cersei caught his arm in a vice-like grip. "No matter what happens," she hissed, her voice sharp and cutting through the noise outside, "this carriage must get back to the Red Keep." The guard nodded, though his expression betrayed a flicker of irritation at what he likely perceived as an obvious command. But Cersei didn't release him. Her fingers tightened, her nails pressing into the leather of his gauntlet. "You must do everything in your power to ensure it," she repeated, her words deliberate and heavy with menace. "Cut them all down if needs be." The guard hesitated, his jaw clenching as he processed the weight of her words. His gaze flickered to the chaos outside, where the crowd pressed closer, their shouts and cries rising into a deafening roar. For a moment, it seemed as though he might protest. "All of them," Cersei said again, her voice low but unyielding. Her eyes burned into his, leaving no room for doubt, no space for mercy. Finally, he nodded, his face hardening into a mask of grim determination. She let go of his arm, and he turned back towards the crowd, drawing his sword as the carriage jolted into motion. Inside, Tommen sat stiffly, his face pale and drawn, his wide eyes darting between the windows as though he expected the crowd to tear through at any moment. His arms clutched Princess Argella so tightly to his chest that Cersei feared for a moment he might harm her. "Did Margaery and Ois get into their carriage?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear. His knuckles were white, his grip on the babe as desperate as his tone. "I didn't see, my love," Cersei said smoothly, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "But I'm sure they are safe." She extended her arms toward him. "Give me the princess and try to breathe." Tommen hesitated, his reluctance plain, but he obeyed. Carefully, he handed the child over, his hands shaking as he did. Cersei cradled the infant against her chest, her movements steady and deliberate, a stark contrast to the panic radiating from her son. The princess was silent, her tiny face serene despite the uproar outside. Cersei looked down into the child's wide, unblinking eyes, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to fade into the background. There was something in those eyes, something that stirred a fierce, almost primal emotion in her chest. This child was not Margaery's. Not truly. She was Circeus. The thought struck her with the force of a revelation, even as she knew it was impossible. But the feeling persisted, irrational and undeniable. Argella had none of Margary's softness, none of her delicate, airy beauty. No, the girl was strong, unyielding, with a quiet intensity in her gaze that mirrored Circe's own. She stroked the babe's cheek with her thumb, her lips curling into a small, bitter smile. Margary might believe she had won, might revel in her position as queen and mother to the future of the realm. But in this moment, with the child nestled against her, Circe felt a surge of possessiveness, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Shush, she murmured, more to herself than to the child, as another stone struck the side of the carriage. You'll be safe with me. Tommen shifted beside her, his hands ringing nervously in his lap. What if the crowd? They won't, Circe interrupted, her tone firm. You're the king, Tommen. They'll know better than to harm you. But even as she said it, she could feel the lie on her tongue. The people outside didn't see a king in Tommen. They saw a boy, a Lannister boy, a symbol of their suffering. And for the first time, Circe realized how fragile their hold on the throne truly was. As they made their way through the winding streets of King's Landing, Circe stared out the carriage window, her expression carefully blank even as her mind raced. The chaos outside was unimaginable. The small folk screamed and fought, hurling themselves at the city guards and soldiers with reckless abandon. Some turned on each other in their desperation, fists flying and weapons flashing in the dim light. Smoke curled into the air as a building they passed erupted into flames, the fire crackling and devouring everything in its path. It was a city unraveling at the seams. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the carriage passed through the heavy gates of the Red Keep. Relief flooded through Circe as the courtyard loomed ahead, guarded and fortified. The instant the wheels stopped, the door was flung open, and they scrambled out. Circe placed a firm hand on Tommen's back, guiding him towards the safety of the keep's interior. Inside, she said sharply, her voice leaving no room for argument. But Tommen stood his ground. No, he said, his tone stronger than she'd expected, though his hands trembled at his sides. I have to wait for them. It's not safe, Your Grace, one of the King's Guard urged, his voice laced with urgency. You can wait inside, Circe said again, this time softening her tone as she looked into her son's fearful eyes. You will be the first to know when they arrive. Tommen hesitated, but before he could move, the gates creaked open again. 3 carriages rolled into the courtyard in quick succession, their wheels rattling against the cobblestones. The sight filled the air with a tense mixture of anticipation and dread. From the first carriage, Margary stepped out, her face pale but determined, Ois clutched tightly in her arms. Her hair, always so perfectly arranged, was slightly disheveled, and her gown was creased from the ordeal. The moment she saw Tommen, she ran to him, and he wrapped her in a fierce embrace. Tears welled in her eyes, but she kept her composure as she pressed her cheek to his. Behind her, Mace and Aeleri Tyrell emerged, their faces marked with the strain of panic. Aeleri sobbed openly, her hands trembling as Mace awkwardly tried to console her, his usual pomposity replaced by uncharacteristic silence. The second carriage opened next, and Olenna Tyrell stepped out with her usual air of command, though her expression was harder than usual, her lips pressed into a grim line. A cluster of Margary's handmaidens followed her, their faces streaked with tears, their dresses rumpled and torn. They huddled together, clearly shaken, clutching one another like frightened children. Circe's focus lingered on Tommen and Margary, who clung to each other as if nothing else existed, their whispered reassurances drowned out by the chaos around them. But the peace of that moment was shattered by a guttural, piercing scream. Aeleri's cry filled the courtyard, wrenching Circe's attention back to the final carriage. She saw Garland Tyrell first, his face ashen and his shoulders stooped as if he bore the weight of the world. In his arms, he held his young son, who was wailing uncontrollably, his small hands clutching at his father's neck. Leonette Tyrell followed close behind, her cheeks streaked with tears, her usually serene countenance shattered. Circe's breath caught as her eyes fell on what, or rather, who, was the cause of Aeleri's shrieking. A King's Guard emerged from behind the young family, bearing the limp form of Melea Caswell. Her once extravagant green and gold gown was soaked in blood, the fabric clinging to her as though painted with the carnage of the day. For one moment, Circe thought she was dead. But then she saw the faintest flutter of Melea's eyelids, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. "She's fine," Garland said flatly, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "She just fainted. It's not her blood." His words were mechanical, as if he were merely reciting facts, his eyes fixed on something far away. He didn't pause as he moved past them, his son still crying in his arms. Leonette, however, froze, her sobs intensifying as she clutched at his arm. "Wait," Margaery called, her voice trembling as she looked around wildly. "Where's Willers?" Her gaze darted to the carriages, searching desperately for her elder brother. "Where is he?" Leonette broke down completely, her words tumbling out between gasping sobs. "We were getting into the carriage," she began, her voice raw with anguish. "Willers was getting in last. The crowd, they surged. They broke through the guards. They grabbed him. Someone kicked his leg, and he buckled. Melea tried to get to him, but someone had a knife and," her words dissolved into incoherence as she buried her face in her hands. Margaery froze, her expression a mask of disbelief. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as though the act could undo the words she'd just heard. "No, that can't be." "He didn't make it," Garland interrupted bluntly, his tone devoid of emotion as he turned back to face the group. "It's his blood." His eyes flickered briefly to Melea's stained dress before returning to the ground. Without another word, he walked past them, disappearing into the keep with his son still clinging to him. The courtyard fell into a stunned silence, broken only by Aelari's sobs and the distant murmur of the city beyond the gates. Margaery sank into Tommen's arms, her body shaking as she wept softly against his chest. Cersei stood apart from them all, clutching Argella to her chest. She watched the scene unfold with a cold detachment, her mind already calculating the implications of this tragedy. Willers Tyrell was dead. The Tyrell family, the foundation of Margaery's power, had just suffered a devastating blow. And as much as Cersei despised Margaery, she couldn't deny the sinking feeling in her chest. This was not a victory. This was chaos, and chaos could not be controlled, not even by her. Chapter 66, Jon V. Chapter text. Jon V. The North had always been a threat in and of itself, a place where survival was a daily struggle and nature itself seemed hostile. Yet now, as Jon stood atop the wall, the cold winds biting at his face, the icy expanse beyond the Whispering Wood felt different, alive, sentient. It wasn't just a frozen wasteland anymore, it was watching him, taunting him. The vast snowy plains and dark forests felt like an enemy in their own right, whispering promises of death and despair. He shivered, and it wasn't from the cold. It had been barely 2 weeks since the Red Woman had dragged him back from the abyss of death, and yet that moment clung to him like a shadow he couldn't escape. It haunted his waking hours, creeping into every corner of his mind. He'd be sitting at breakfast, staring at the pale bread and thin porridge, only to suddenly feel himself back on the table, surrounded by flickering candlelight. The memory of thick mud smeared across his neck returned, as vivid as the day it happened. It had felt suffocating, as though the weight of the entire wall had been pressing down on him. He could still feel the burning stares of the men and women who had watched, wide-eyed and fearful, as Melisandre worked her dark magic. Their whispers lingered in his ears, even when no one was speaking. And when he wasn't consumed by those thoughts, his sleep offered no reprieve. The dreams were worse than the waking moments. In the darkness of his unconscious mind, he returned to the void, an endless blackness beyond life itself. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. It was a silent, oppressive eternity that felt like being buried alive. Each time he woke gasping for air, the sweat freezing against his skin in the freezing nights of Castle Black, he wondered if it was better to have stayed dead. Jon tore his gaze from the north and looked down at his hands. They gripped the edge of the wall tightly, his knuckles white against the grey stone. These hands felt like his, but not. He had held a sword with these hands, comforted Ghost with them, even died with them, and yet they felt wrong. There were moments when he wondered if he truly was Jon Snow anymore. The men of the Night's Watch looked at him differently now. Some with awe, others with fear. He was no longer their brother-in-arms, their Lord Commander. He was something else, something returned. And he wasn't sure he liked it. Jon sighed, the sound swallowed by the wind. He was a man torn. Torn between the living and the dead, between duty and freedom, between who he was and who he might have become. He gripped the stone harder, as if anchoring himself to the present. "I'm still here," he muttered under his breath, though the words felt hollow. The wind answered him with a howl, as if mocking his defiance. What did it mean to be alive after death? Was he still meant to be Lord Commander, bound by his oath to the wall? Or was there a greater purpose behind his return, one that neither Melisandre nor the Lord of Light had chosen to share? He had no answers, only questions that gnawed at him like wolves at a carcass. Looking out beyond the wall, Jon's chest tightened. The north stretched out before him, vast and unyielding, but he knew what lay hidden there. The dead were coming. Every breath of icy wind carried the memory of Hardham, the screams of the living, the silent march of the dead. Every shadow in the trees seemed to whisper of the White Walkers, their pale faces and frozen swords. The north was watching, and it was waiting. And Jon Snow, returned from the grave, was not sure he was ready to meet it. He thought of those he had left behind in the void, faces that haunted him more than the darkness itself. Sam, with his nervous smile and endless loyalty, Ygritte, fiery and fierce, her voice still echoing in his ears as if she were standing beside him, teasing him about being a crow. Ghost, his ever-faithful companion, who had followed him to the ends of the earth and beyond, now more a part of this strange existence than he was himself. And his father, the memory of Ned Stark loomed largest of all, a figure of unwavering honor and quiet strength, whose lessons had guided Jon's life. Why them? Why had they been taken while he was dragged back into this world? Why did he deserve another chance and not them? The thought gnawed at him, a constant ache that no amount of cold or steel could numb. The injustice of it made him clench his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He imagined Sam's face, pale and frightened but always steadfast, willing to risk everything for Jon. He thought of Ygritte's laughter, how it had once felt like sunlight piercing through the bitter cold. He thought of his father's steady hand on his shoulder, the weight of his expectations mixed with the unspoken love that had always been there. All of them gone. And for what? To leave him here, alone in a world that no longer felt like his own. Maybe this was all some cruel joke, he thought bitterly. Maybe the so-called Lord of Light, with all his mysterious fire and prophecy, was a liar, a trickster playing games with lives as if they were pawns on a board. Perhaps this second chance wasn't a gift but a punishment. A punishment for failing, for falling, for letting himself be killed in the first place. The thought twisted inside him like a knife. If the Lord of Light had dragged him back from death's clutches, what was to stop him from doing it again? To bring him back just to kill him over and over, a cruel cycle without end. Jon felt his chest tighten, his breaths coming quicker. The weight of it all was suffocating. Perhaps he wasn't meant to be alive. Perhaps this was all temporary, and he would be with them again sooner than he thought. Sam would be waiting for him, a book in hand and a nervous smile on his face. Ygritte would pull him close, her fiery hair wild in the wind, and tell him once again, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." Ghost would come bounding through the darkness, a streak of white that would lead him home. And his father would look at him with those steady grey eyes, a gaze that held no judgment, only understanding. The image was so vivid that it brought tears to his eyes. He blinked them away quickly, ashamed of the weakness. "Lord Commander." A voice cut through Jon's turbulent thoughts. He turned to see Gendry standing behind him, his broad shoulders dusted with snow and his expression as steady as always. "How many times, Gendry?" Jon said, his voice carrying a hint of weariness. "I'm not your commander anymore. I died, my watch ended, and the command fell to you, as it should. I should be addressing you as Lord Commander." The corners of Jon's mouth twitched into a faint smile, a flicker of amusement breaking through his somber mood. "You'll always be my commander," Gendry said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "In this life and every lifetime." There was a loyalty in his tone that stirred something deep within Jon, a mix of gratitude and guilt. Jon smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You've got the title now. It's your burden to carry." Before Gendry could respond, his expression shifted slightly, turning more serious. "There's been a raven," he said, holding out a parchment. "From your brother. Daenerys Targaryen has set sail for Winterfell." The words hung in the frigid air between them. John's eyes fixed on the letter, though he didn't reach for it. He felt his heart tighten. Rob. John's grip tightened on the railing of the wall, his knuckles turning white. He had made a decision weeks ago, one that he had questioned every day since. He had chosen not to tell his family that he was back. They had already buried him, mourned him, added his name to the long list of dead Starks. They were still grieving for Ned, and now Catelyn, too, taken by her own sorrow after Ned's execution. His brothers and sisters would still be reeling from it all. Jon couldn't bring himself to burden them with this strange, unnatural resurrection. How could they ever look at him the same way again? Would they even want to? He wasn't the same man who had ridden north to Hardham or who had stood as Lord Commander. He had died. And what had come back was something else entirely, someone who felt as much ghost as man. "They've been through enough," Jon said finally, his voice low, almost to himself. Gendry studied him for a moment. "You think it'll hurt them to know you're alive?" he asked, blunt as ever. "Or is it just you who's afraid to face them?" Jon flinched at the words, but they rang with truth, hitting him like a blow he couldn't dodge. He clenched his jaw, staring out over the endless white expanse beyond the wall. He didn't answer immediately, his silence filled by the distant howl of the wind. "They mourned me," he said at last, his voice low and strained. "Let them have their peace. I don't want to confuse them," or, he trailed off, searching for the words, but they wouldn't come. What could he even say to justify it? That he feared the looks on their faces, the questions they would ask, the things they might not say but would think. Instead, he shook his head and forced himself to focus. "We can only hope that she's coming as a friend," he said, pivoting to safer ground. "Her dragons could be the thing that turns the tide for us. If they're not, then we're already lost." "May I speak my mind, my lord?" Gendry started but stopped himself, a flicker of a grin breaking through his otherwise serious expression. "Jon," he corrected himself. "Always," Jon said, managing a faint smile in return. He turned to face the blacksmith-turned-commander, ready for whatever practical, grounded wisdom Gendry was about to offer. The man always seemed to cut straight to the heart of things, as if swinging a hammer at the truth itself. "You should go to them," Gendry said plainly. "To Winterfell." Jon's brow furrowed, and he opened his mouth to argue, but Gendry held up a hand. "Hear me out," he pressed. "When the dead reach us here, we can meet them head-on, sure. But let's not lie to ourselves, we won't beat them, not on the wall. You've seen what they can do. Our only real chance at a last stand is at Winterfell. That's where it has to happen. And if that's where it has to happen, then you should be there. They need you." "I'm needed here," Jon said, his voice firm, but there was a slight edge of doubt to it. He wasn't even sure he believed himself anymore. "You're needed everywhere," Gendry countered, "but that doesn't mean you have to stay here. I'm not saying this because I think you're the chosen one, or the prophesied hero, or any of the other bloody titles the Red Woman likes to throw around." There was a flicker of amusement in his voice, but his expression remained earnest. "I'm saying it because I've had the honor of serving under you for 5 years. I've fought beside you. I've watched you lead, watched you take a group of boys, scared, green, and untested, and turn them into men who would march into hell for you without a second thought. You should be at Winterfell, beside your brother, leading his forces. You belong there, Jon. He doesn't stand a chance without you." Jon's lips pressed into a thin line. The words struck deep, but he wasn't ready to let them in fully. "I'm a man of the Night's Watch," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. "My place is here." "I thought you said your watch was over," Gendry said with a sly smirk, his tone softening as he stepped back toward the lift. "A man doesn't get to have it both ways, Jon." Jon opened his mouth to respond, but Gendry was already turning away, the creak of the lift breaking the silence as it descended toward the ground. For a long moment, Jon stood alone atop the wall, the weight of Gendry's words settling heavily on his shoulders. He turned his gaze back to the vast, unending white, to the whispering woods beyond, to the enemy that waited for them all. He thought of Robb, of Winterfell, of his family, what was left of it. The wind howled in his ears, and he felt the cold settle deeper into his bones. Gendry's words wouldn't leave him. "They need you." Jon let out a long, heavy breath, the mist of it carried away on the wind. Maybe Gendry was right. Maybe it was time to leave the wall behind, for good. Underscore 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 underscore. As night fell, Jon summoned Davos and Gendry to the Lord Commander's chambers. The room was sparsely lit by a single flickering candle, the fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers. The weight of the day, and the days before it, seemed to press down on all three men as they settled into the room. Jon stood, leaning against the edge of the table, his brow furrowed as he wrestled with his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "I've decided to go to Winterfell," he announced, the words heavy in the air. He glanced at Gendry, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "A wise man convinced me that I might be needed there." Gendry grinned, his arms crossed over his chest. "A wise man, was it? I'll have to meet him someday." Jon let out a soft chuckle, a rare moment of levity breaking through the somber mood. But it didn't last long. His expression hardened as he continued, his voice steady. "But I will not leave the wall undefended. Gendry, you are Lord Commander now. These are your men to command. I'll not strip away resources from you, you'll need every man, every weapon, every ounce of strength to hold this line. The wall must stand." Gendry's grin faded, replaced by a look of resolve. "The wall will stand, Jon. I swear it." Jon nodded, satisfied with the response, and turned to Davos. "We need to move quickly and quietly. The Lannisters cannot know I'm alive." Davos, who had been sitting with his hands folded on the table, straightened at Jon's words. "The latest owls from the north report that the Lannisters are moving south, and fast," he said. "There was some unrest in King's Landing. Tywin's first priority has always been keeping the Boy King safe." "Good," Jon said, his tone sharp. "Then they need to keep moving south. We'll give them no reason to turn their gaze back to us." There was a brief silence before Gendry spoke up again, his voice carrying a hint of mischief. "Your brother and Meera are going with you." Jon blinked, taken aback. "Bran. He hasn't even spoken to me about returning to Winterfell." "He didn't need to," Gendry said with a shrug. "He's been waiting for you to make the first move. He had me working on a saddle for him as soon as he arrived, a special one to help him ride. Bran's not one for sitting still, and he's ready to see your family's seat again." "I'm coming too," Davos said suddenly, breaking Jon's train of thought. Jon turned to him, his brow furrowing. "Davos, you've done more than enough. You've fought for me, for Stannis, for the living. You don't need to." "I do," Davos interrupted, his voice low but firm. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "To speak candidly, Jon, I can't stay here anymore. I see her every time I turn a corner, every time I enter a room, every time I sit by a fire. She's everywhere." His voice faltered for a moment before he steadied himself. "I don't mean to offend you both," he said, glancing between Jon and Gendry. "I know this is your home. But I hope I never come back to this godforsaken place." Jon felt a pang of sympathy, his gaze softening. He knew what Davos meant. The wall was no longer just a fortress, it had become a graveyard of memories, a place where the living lingered alongside the ghosts of those they had lost. "Very well," Jon said after a moment, his tone resigned. "But if you're coming, I need you focused. Winterfell is no safe haven anymore. If Daenerys is coming, she brings her dragons, her armies, and who knows what else. We don't know if she's friend or foe, and we can't afford to assume anything." Davos nodded solemnly. "I'll be focused," he promised. "You have my word." Jon looked between the two men, his closest allies now. They had all come so far, and yet the road ahead seemed longer and darker than ever. "Then we leave at first light," he said. He didn't know what awaited him at Winterfell, dragons, family, or more loss. But he did know one thing, the wall couldn't be the end of his story. Not yet. underscore 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 underscore. John was up well before dawn, moving through the quiet chill of the courtyard as he prepared the horses for the journey ahead. The air was biting, the kind that nipped at his skin and turned his breath to mist. He worked swiftly, checking the reins and saddles of the 4 horses they'd be taking. They would ride fast and hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary, and resting only once they reached Winterfell. As he finished securing his own mount, the first hints of sunlight began to creep over the horizon. John paused, leaning on the stable post as he watched the sky shift from deep black to muted shades of purple and orange. It was a rare moment of peace, a brief respite from the chaos that seemed to dog his every step. The sun rose, bold and unyielding, painting the sky in gold and fire. For a moment, John felt the enormity of it all, the wall behind him, the dead beyond it, and the unknown that lay ahead. "The Lord of Light gifts us another morning," came a familiar voice from behind him. John turned, his expression hardening as he saw Melisandre standing in the courtyard. She was wrapped in flowing red cloth of varying hues, the folds of her robe catching the early light like blood against the snow. She looked serene, almost otherworldly, her presence still unsettling despite all he had endured. He didn't bother replying to her comment, unwilling to entertain her cryptic musings. Instead, he said bluntly, "You're free to go. There's no need to punish you for what you did to the princess. Your own guilt for destroying that family should be punishment enough." Melisandre's expression didn't flicker, her calm unbroken. "I will be staying right here, Jon Snow," she said, her voice steady but weighted with conviction. "The Lord of Light has shown me glimpses of the future. I will stand here, and I will fall here." Jon's jaw tightened. He didn't want this conversation, didn't want her riddles or her prophecies or her half-truths cloaked in certainty. He turned away, focusing his attention back on the horses. Yet despite himself, he could feel the weight of her gaze on him, the unspoken tension hanging in the air. "I don't want to hear your visions," Jon said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Whatever you think you've seen, whatever you think I'm meant to do, keep it to yourself." Melisandre stepped closer, her movements deliberate. "It doesn't matter what you want to hear," she said softly. "The truth will find you, Jon Snow, whether you seek it or not. But I will tell you this, you and Daenerys Targaryen are 2 sides of the same coin. When the time comes, you both will pay the ultimate price." Jon's fists clenched at her words, his instincts screaming at him to end the conversation, to leave her and her forebodings behind. But her hand reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his own. Her touch was cool, despite the warmth of her presence. "Don't fight it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When it starts, you will know that you are on the right path." Jon wanted to demand more, answers, clarity, something to make sense of her cryptic words. But before he could muster a response, movement caught his eye. Across the courtyard, Meera Reed appeared, wheeling Bran into the open. Behind them walked Davos, his weathered face set with grim determination. Jon turned his attention back to Melisandre, but she had already moved. She climbed the stone steps to the balcony overlooking the courtyard, her red robes trailing behind her like flowing fire. She stopped by a torch, gazing into its flickering flames as if searching for some hidden truth. For a moment, she glanced back at him, her eyes dark and unreadable. Jon turned away, suppressing the urge to call out after her. There was no point. Whatever answers she thought she held, Jon didn't trust them. He didn't trust her. As he walked towards Bran and Meera, he resolved to put her words out of his mind. Whatever lay ahead, destiny, sacrifice, or doom, he would face it on his own terms. Jon stood by Bran's side, adjusting the straps of the special saddle Gendry had crafted for him. The morning light had fully broken now, the golden hues spreading across the snow-draped courtyard, glinting off the frost that coated the stone walls of Castle Black. It was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of the Night's Watch subdued as if the wall itself was holding its breath. "Are you ready?" Jon asked, his voice low as he looked at his younger brother, who sat impassively in his chair, his pale face as unreadable as ever. Bran's sharp blue eyes turned to meet his. "Are you?" he replied simply, his tone carrying a weight far beyond his years. John hesitated, caught off guard by the gravity of the question. Before he could answer, Davos cleared his throat, stepping forward to check the straps on his own horse. "It's strange," Davos said, breaking the tension. "Leaving here after so long. It must be even stranger for you, John. The wall was your life for years. Your brothers, your duty." His words trailed off, as if the enormity of it was catching up to him even as he spoke. John gave a small nod, his hand absently stroking his horse's mane. "I'm sure I'll return," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. He glanced up at the towering wall, the colossal structure that had been both his prison and his sanctuary. "This place is as much my home as Winterfell." Bran's voice cut through the morning stillness, quiet but firm. "None of us will return to Castle Black," he said flatly. John turned to him, the boy's words unsettling him in a way Melisandre's prophecies never could. Bran's voice didn't hold the theatrical cadence of the Red Woman's proclamations. There was no room for interpretation, no cryptic undertone. His words were simply true. John felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He opened his mouth to respond, but found he had nothing to say. Instead, he focused on helping Meera lift Bran from his chair and onto the horse. The saddle fit him perfectly, holding him securely as Meera adjusted the straps and reins. She worked silently, her expression determined, but John could see the weight she carried. Her duty to Bran had taken her far from her home and into dangers few could fathom. Once Bran was settled, John moved to his own mount, pulling himself into the saddle. He glanced over at Davos, who was checking the straps on the pack horse they were bringing along, and then to Meera, who climbed onto her own horse beside Bran. John looked back towards the castle as the gates began to creak open. On the balcony above, Gendry stood watching them, his broad frame silhouetted against the grey stone. Beside him was Melisandre, her red robes vivid against the bleak backdrop. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her face calm but unreadable as she gazed down at them. John met Gendry's eyes, and despite everything, a small smile tugged at his lips. He raised a hand in a silent farewell, a nod of gratitude and camaraderie. Gendry returned the gesture, his expression serious but filled with unspoken understanding. Melisandre, however, remained still. Her piercing gaze was locked on John, her lips moving ever so slightly, as if she were murmuring a prayer or incantation. John didn't linger on her for long. He had no need for her riddles now. Whatever role she believed he played in her prophecies, he would find his own path forward. The gates swung fully open, the cold wind rushing in from the tundra beyond. For a moment, John hesitated, taking in the sight of Castle Black one last time. The walls that had once seemed so impenetrable, so eternal, now felt small and fragile in the face of the great unknown that lay ahead. With a deep breath, John gave his horse a light kick, and they began to move forward. The sound of hooves crunching in the snow echoed in the stillness as the four of them rode out into the open expanse of the north. John didn't look back again. Bran's words lingered in his mind, as heavy and unyielding as the wall itself. "None of us will return to Castle Black." The wall had always been a shield, a dividing line between civilization and the chaos beyond. But now, as John led his small company south toward Winterfell, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shield was cracking, and that whatever waited for them in the days to come would change everything. Chapter 67, Daenerys 2. Notes. Hi all. There has been a minor update to Chapter 56, in relation to Roslyn's sister Taita, who is currently married to Roose Bolton. It's a little update that impacts something that happens in this chapter, so go back and read from when the Boltons enter in that chapter to be 100% on the same page as me. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. Daenerys 2. Winterfell below her looked like a doll's house, a patchwork of snow-covered stone walls and thatched rooftops nestled amidst the vast, icy expanse of the north. Daenerys had never quite grown accustomed to the sight of the world from Drogon's back, even after all these years. The wind whipped through her hair, stinging her cheeks despite the heavy fur-lined cloak she wore, but she had long learned to ignore the discomfort. From this height, she could see everything, the swarming masses of her army trudging through the snow, their formations spreading out like dark veins against the whitened ground, the narrow, frost-dusted roads leading to Winterfell's gates, and the tiny figures of northerners huddled at the walls, waiting to see if the arrival of a foreign queen would bring salvation, or doom. Besides her, Viserion and Rorigal circled the keep like restless shadows against the pale winter sky, their scales catching the faint sunlight. The sight of her dragons over Winterfell was still surreal to her. Dragons over the north, a land as old and unyielding as the wall itself. The people below had likely never seen anything like it, not in centuries. Some craned their necks upward, shielding their eyes from the sun to glimpse the beasts. Others recoiled, scurrying back to the safety of the walls or whispering hurried prayers. Far below, her army pressed forward. The Unsullied marched in perfect formation despite the cold, their discipline unbroken even by the bitter winds. The Dothraki were less reserved, whooping and calling out to one another as they rode, their breath forming great clouds in the frozen air. The journey from White Harbor to Winterfell had been hard on them all, especially her eastern soldiers. The icy northern climate was a far cry from the warmth of Essos or even Dragonstone, and she had seen the toll it took in their shivering forms and frost-bitten hands. Yet they pressed on, their loyalty unwavering, their belief in her absolute. Daenerys tightened her grip on Drogon's reins and scanned the keep below. The gates of Winterfell stood open, flanked by watchful guards. At least Lady Stark's promise of a warm welcome had proven true. She had been skeptical, despite the letters exchanged between her hand and Robb Stark. The North was known for its stubbornness, its distrust of outsiders. The arrival of a foreign queen with dragons and armies in tow might have been met with hostility or worse. But the gates were open, and the banners of House Stark flew high on the ramparts, their direwolf sigil snapping in the wind. The sight stirred something in her, a small flicker of hope. She urged Drogon lower, descending gradually toward the courtyard. The soldiers below began to cheer as the dragon's shadows swept over them, their voices rising in a cacophony of awe and fear. Daenerys allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of it, the majesty of her arrival, the significance of this moment. She had crossed the narrow sea to reclaim the Seven Kingdoms, but this was something else. Winterfell was no southern castle of gold and marble, it was a fortress of stone and steel, built for survival in a harsh world. Its people were not courtiers or sycophants, they were fighters, hardened by endless winters and battles fought in the snow. Winning their loyalty would not be easy, but it was necessary. When the time came, the North was the key to winning back her throne. As Drogon's claws touched down in the courtyard, his great wings folding against his sides, Daenerys felt a surge of nerves she hadn't expected. The Northerners gathered in the yard looked up at her with wide eyes, their faces a mixture of fear, awe, and skepticism. She slid from Drogon's back with practiced ease, landing lightly on the frozen ground. The chill bit through her boots, but she stood tall, her head held high, her cloak billowing behind her. Missandei approached her quickly, wrapping her in a heavy woolen scarf as Grey Worm dismounted nearby, his expression stoic. Tyrion was next to join her, his face half hidden by his fur-lined hood. He took in the scene with sharp, calculating eyes, his breath clouding in the air. Winterfell, Tyrion said, his voice tinged with both admiration and doubt. A fortress as cold as the people who built it. Let's hope they've warmed to the idea of your dragons. Daenerys didn't reply. Her gaze had fixed on the figures emerging from the castle's doors to greet her. At the forefront was Robb Stark, tall and broad-shouldered, his stark grey cloak trimmed with wolf fur. His expression was neutral, guarded, but his eyes betrayed curiosity and perhaps a hint of respect. Beside him stood Sansa Stark, her red hair a beacon in the pale courtyard, her face unreadable. And slightly behind them, Jon Snow. Jon stood apart, his dark eyes locked on her as she approached. He looked different from how Tyrion had described him, taller, more formidable, though there was an unmistakable sadness etched into his features. Daenerys felt a sudden pang of something she couldn't name, an odd pull as their eyes met. The sound of Rorigal and Viserion landing behind her broke the spell, their massive wings stirring the snow. She tore her gaze from Jon and turned to greet her northern hosts. Whatever warmth they had promised in their letters would need to be earned in person, and Daenerys was determined to prove herself worthy of their trust. From behind her, Roslyn Stark surged forward, the air of formality vanishing in an instant as Robb Stark stepped toward her, gathering his wife into a tight embrace. The weight of Winterfell's stoic tradition seemed to lift as he kissed her, his affection unguarded and unashamed. Roslyn melted into him, her face lighting up with an unrestrained smile. Rob took a moment to stroke her cheek with his gloved hand, his touch tender despite the leather between them. His expression held a depth of love so profound that Daenerys felt a pang in her chest, a sharp reminder of what she had once known with Khal Drogo. That kind of love, unyielding and all-consuming, had only graced her life once, and she doubted she would ever feel it again. Before Daenerys could linger on the thought, movement caught her eye. From behind Robb and Roslyn, a small boy broke free from the arms of a slender, brown-haired girl. His laughter rang out across the courtyard as he darted forward, unbothered by the snow that crunched underfoot. Roslyn crouched instinctively, catching him in her arms and lifting him with a delighted laugh. She held him tightly, pressing her cheek against his small head, and for a moment, mother and son were in their own world. This, Daenerys reasoned, must be Torrhen, the young Stark heir. Daenerys observed the scene with quiet admiration, feeling the warmth of it despite the frigid air. It was a sight she had never truly known, family, whole and intact, brimming with love despite the shadows of war that loomed over them. To her right, Tyrion shifted awkwardly, his gaze fixed on the reunion before them. He glanced toward Daenerys, his sharp eyes holding a question. Daenerys met his look and gave a small nod of approval, understanding the unspoken request. Without hesitation, Tyrion stepped forward, his measured gait carrying him across the courtyard to where Sansa stood. Sansa was radiant despite the cold, her auburn hair catching the weak winter sunlight as it cascaded over her shoulders. She stood beside a young boy with golden blonde hair, his small face turned up toward her, and at Tyrion's approach, she bent down and murmured something in the boy's ear. With a nudge of encouragement, the child broke into a smile and sprinted toward Tyrion, calling out, "Papa." The single word echoed like a burst of joy amidst the frost. Tyrion crouched low to catch him, wrapping his arms around the boy in a fierce, protective hug. His face softened, and for a brief moment, the usually guarded hand of the queen seemed utterly disarmed. Hand in hand with the boy, whom Daenerys reasoned must be Daemon, Tyrion walked back toward Sansa. She had a small, content smile on her lips as she stooped slightly to meet them. Tyrion placed a gentle kiss on her cheek, and though the gesture was reserved, it spoke volumes of their bond. Sansa's hand briefly brushed Tyrion's shoulder, a subtle but deliberate act of reassurance. "Your Grace." Robb Stark's voice broke through Daenerys's thoughts. She turned to find him standing tall once more, his wife now at his side. Roslyn's son sat perched on her hip, his tiny arms wrapped securely around her neck as he peered at the scene with wide, curious eyes. "You must forgive our informality," Robb said, his tone warm and apologetic. "I'm afraid here in Winterfell, we are family first and lords second. I am Lord Robb Stark, and this is my son, Torrhen. My wife's letters have spoken so highly of you that I've been eager to meet you." Roslyn's expression softened as she stood by her husband, her cheeks still faintly flushed from the cold and their earlier embrace. Torrhen buried his face shyly in her neck, peeking out at Daenerys with the timid curiosity of a child. "Lady Roslyn is too kind," Daenerys replied, her voice measured but sincere. She stepped forward, the fur-lined cloak trailing behind her as she regarded the Stark family before her. "I fear I may not live up to such high praise, though I will do my best. Your hospitality is already greatly appreciated." Robb smiled, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "You've come a long way to be here, Your Grace, and Winterfell honors that. You are welcome here as an ally and, if the gods will it, as a friend." Daenerys inclined her head in thanks, though her mind raced. The Starks' warmth and sincerity were disarming, but she knew well that alliances built on trust could be fragile. Still, for the first time in a long while, standing amidst the echoes of family and laughter, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. "This is my brother," Robb Stark said, his voice steady with a mix of pride and deference. He gestured to the man standing at the end of the line, his dark cloak billowing faintly in the wind. "Jon Snow. He has faced the threat we now prepare for and survived. He will lead our army in the battles to come." Daenerys's gaze shifted to the man in question. Jon Snow stood apart from the others, his posture composed yet unassuming. His dark eyes, framed by thick brows, met hers with a flicker of curiosity, though there was a guardedness behind them, as if he carried the weight of too many burdens. His cloak, lined with fur, seemed more practical than ceremonial, and the faint scar that encircled his throat caught her eye. It was pale against the rough stubble on his jaw, and though it was partially obscured by the angle of his stance, she couldn't discern where it began or ended. "You don't intend to lead yourself?" Daenerys asked, her tone even but inquisitive as her gaze flicked back to Robb. "Your Grace," Robb began, straightening slightly as he addressed her, "I am simply the lord of this keep. While that grants me authority over the North, it doesn't make me the most experienced or skilled commander for the fight ahead. I have fought men and won, I have stood on battlefields and faced armies intent on taking my life. But what I have not done," he paused, his tone sharpening with grim honesty, "is kill a man and then watch him rise again. Jon has. He's seen what lies beyond the wall, what we face. He's the right person to lead us." Daenerys's gaze returned to Jon, studying him more intently now. There was something about him, an unspoken resilience, a quiet strength that seemed to hum beneath his skin. Yet, there was also something else, something heavier, like he carried secrets no one else could understand. Her eyes flicked briefly to the scar again, and a faint shiver passed through her. Whatever had caused that mark, it hadn't been a simple wound, it had been something brutal, something that perhaps should have killed him. And yet, here he stood. Jon met her stare, unflinching. "Your Grace," he said simply, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of a man who had seen more than his share of death. Before Daenerys could respond, Roslyn stepped forward, her voice breaking the moment. "Let us move inside, Your Grace," she said, her tone warm but insistent. "I'm sure you're not accustomed to this cold." She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, her cheeks tinged pink from the biting wind. Daenerys glanced at the woman, her smile softening. "You're right, Lady Stark," she said. "Though I have grown somewhat used to the winds at sea, this northern chill is unique." Roslyn chuckled lightly, gesturing for Daenerys to follow her. "Unique is a kind word for it," she replied, her smile momentarily lifting the somberness of the moment. "But Winterfell's halls are warm, and we've prepared everything for your arrival." As they began to move toward the keep, Daenerys felt the tension ease slightly. Yet, as her footsteps crunched against the snow, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jon Snow's presence carried a story that she wasn't yet privy to. She glanced back over her shoulder briefly, catching one last glimpse of him as he exchanged quiet words with Robb. Her dragons circled above, their shadows flickering across the snowy courtyard, a reminder of her own power and the war that lay ahead. For now, there was warmth and conversation to be had within Winterfell's walls, but soon, very soon, the North would face a reckoning that no fire or blade alone could stave off. And Daenerys couldn't help but wonder if Jon Snow truly was the key to it all. Underscore 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 underscore. Inside the great hall of Winterfell, the air was thick with anticipation and tension. The lords and ladies of every assembled house stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and dread. The North had gathered its strength, every man and woman rugged and resilient, embodying the unforgiving land they called home. At the forefront stood Robb Stark, the Lord of Winterfell, his presence commanding, his arm draped protectively over Roslyn, who stood proudly beside him. Her soft features belied the steel within her, forged by years of survival and steadfast devotion to her husband and their people. To their left, the River Lords stood united under the banner of House Tully. Edmure Tully, broad-shouldered and proud, bore the weight of his house as he stood with his beautiful wife, Alex, at his side. Her sharp eyes swept the room, filled with quiet resolve. Her hands rested on the back of a chair, gripping it tightly as if willing herself to stand taller under the heavy burden they all shared. Further along, the Knights of the Vale stood in orderly ranks, their gleaming armor a stark contrast to the rough-hewn furs of the northern men. They were led by Sir Harold Hardyng, Harry the Heir, who carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His keen eyes betrayed an underlying awareness of the immense task ahead. Lord Robin Arryn, however, was conspicuously absent, his mother having chosen to keep him in the Eyrie, far from the dangers that loomed. The Vale Knights stood as a testament to their loyalty, even without their lord present. The Ironborn contingent was notably small, their grim demeanors reflecting the hard lives they had lived. Yara Greyjoy and her husband had returned to Pike to oversee their fleet, a mighty armada poised on the northwestern coast, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Though their absence was felt, the threat of their naval power was a comfort, a sharp blade ready to cut through their enemies when the time came. Further south, Tristan Martel had returned to Dawn, his departure a strategic necessity. He had promised aid if they triumphed, though his quiet return to the Sunspear revealed his pragmatism. If they failed, Dawn would have no choice but to bow before the Lannisters and beg for mercy. The weight of such a gamble hung heavily in the air, but the Dornish had never been ones to fight battles they couldn't win. As Daenerys surveyed the room, she couldn't help but feel the enormity of what had been assembled. Every corner of the realm, from the frigid north to the sun-drenched south, was represented here in some capacity. Yet for all their strength, she knew the reality they faced. If the combined forces of these great houses could not stop the dead, nothing would stand between the White Walkers and King's Landing. The thought chilled her to her very core. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows across the faces of the assembled lords and ladies. Some whispered quietly amongst themselves, while others stood silently, their gazes fixed on the stark banners that hung from the walls. There was a solemnity to the gathering, an unspoken understanding that this alliance, so tenuous and unprecedented, was their last hope. Jon Snow entered the hall from a side door, his presence immediately commanding attention. He moved through the gathered nobles with an ease that spoke of his years as both a warrior and a leader. Though he was now technically just a guest in Winterfell, every eye in the room turned to him with a mix of respect and curiosity. They had heard the stories of his resurrection, of his battles beyond the wall, and of the countless dead he had faced. Jon carried himself with the weight of that knowledge, his dark cloak billowing slightly as he approached Daenerys. The room seemed to still as Jon and Daenerys exchanged a brief glance. Two leaders, each bearing the burden of prophecy and destiny, stood side by side amidst the gathered forces of the living. The weight of expectation pressed down on both of them, but neither faltered. "Shall we begin?" Jon asked, his voice low but firm as he turned to Daenerys. For a moment, her gaze lingered on his. There was something in his eyes, an unspoken connection. She wasn't sure if it was born of this life or another, but it was undeniable. With a steadying breath, she nodded and stepped aside, granting him the floor. Jon strode to the center of the hall, his presence commanding the attention of every lord, lady, and soldier in the room. The crackling of the fire in the great hearth seemed to hush as all eyes turned to him. "You all know why we're here," he began, his voice strong, carrying the weight of the moment. "The dead have risen, and they are coming for us." The room fell utterly silent as his words settled over them like a heavy frost. "Our men on the wall have confirmed what we feared. The dead are no longer a distant threat, they are here. By tomorrow night, they will reach the wall." His words were sharp, cutting through any lingering doubts. "The Night's Watch will do everything they can to hold them back, but the reality is this: they will break through. And when they do, they will come for us." Daenerys watched in awe as Jon spoke. It wasn't just his words, it was the way he carried himself, the gravity in his tone, the quiet strength that made every person in the room hang on his every syllable. It was the kind of command she had dreamed of her entire life, the kind of respect that could not be demanded, only earned. "We are grateful to Queen Daenerys for her support," Jon continued, gesturing to her. "Her men, her Unsullied, and her dragons could be the thing that turns the tide in our favor." Daenerys stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "We have also brought all the dragon glass we could mine in such short time." Jon gave her a brief nod, seamlessly picking up her point. "We need to turn that dragon glass into weapons as quickly as possible. Arrowheads, daggers, spears, anything that can be forged fast and put into a soldier's hand. Focus on simple designs, sharp points and sturdy hilts. Speed is our ally here." Robb stepped in, his tone firm yet practical. "We are expecting a siege. Those unable to fight, children, the elderly, will be sheltered in the crypts. We must be prepared for the possibility that this siege could last for days, even weeks. This is not a normal army we face, they do not tire, they do not need food or sleep. We will work in shifts, allowing everyone to rest when possible. And when the moment comes, when the dead falter, we will launch a final, decisive attack." The room buzzed with murmurs, the weight of Robb's words sinking in. The lords exchanged glances, the enormity of the challenge before them dawning on each face. Jon's voice cut through the murmur. "From now until the dead arrive, there will be daily drills in the yard. Everyone who can hold a weapon must train, men and women alike. Ultimately, the choice to fight is yours, he said, his voice softening, but know this, I speak to you not just as a commander, but as a brother. His eyes met Rob's. As an uncle. His gaze flickered to Torrin, who clung to Roslyn's side. And as a man of honor. I swear to you, I will not let anyone take this castle. For a moment, there was silence. Then the men in the room erupted into a roar of agreement, their voices filling the great hall like a storm crashing against the walls. The sound of their determination was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the doom that loomed beyond the wall. Rob raised a hand to quiet them. Now go and rest, he said. We begin at first light. The lords and soldiers began to shuffle out, their expressions set with grim determination. But before they could fully disperse, Daenerys stepped forward. Her voice, clear and regal, carried across the room. Wait. The men paused, turning back to her with confusion. Daenerys's gaze swept the hall, landing on the women still gathered among them. All of the ladies in the room, she said, her tone commanding yet warm, please remain. The lords exchanged glances, clearly perplexed. Rob, ever the diplomat, stepped in. Of course, Your Grace. He turned to Roslyn, placing a kiss on her cheek, before scooping Torrin into his arms. With a nod to Daenerys, he led the men out of the hall, the heavy wooden doors creaking shut behind them. As the room emptied, Daenerys turned her full attention to the women who remained. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Sansa stood among them, her face calm and unreadable, though her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Alex Tully lingered near the edge of the group, her fingers fidgeting with the fabric of her sleeve. Tita Bolton stood apart, her posture stiff, her eyes darting toward the doors as if expecting Roose to barge back in. Daenerys stepped forward, her voice softer now but no less commanding. I have called you here because I believe you deserve a voice in what happens next. Too often, women are expected to stay silent, to wait in the shadows while men decide their fate. That will not happen here. Not under my watch. The women looked at one another, some nodding tentatively, others still wary. You are mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters, Daenerys continued. But you are also the backbone of this kingdom. You carry its future. If we are to survive, it will be because of all of us, men and women alike. I will not ask you to fight if you do not wish to, but I will ask you to be honest. Tell me your fears, your hopes, your needs. Together, we will find a way to protect what matters most. Alex stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. I'm afraid, she admitted. Not just of the dead, but of what comes after. If we win, what kind of world will be left for us? For our children. Tita's voice cut through the room, sharp and brittle. Some of us are more afraid of the men standing beside us than the dead coming for us. The room fell silent, her words hanging heavy in the air. Daenerys met Tita's gaze, her expression one of quiet understanding. You have my word, Daenerys said, her voice firm. I will not let anyone harm you. When I take the Iron Throne, the days of fear and abuse will end. Please, my lady, Daenerys said gently, her voice warm and inviting. She extended a hand, motioning for the woman who stood hesitantly near the edge of the gathering to step forward. Tell me of your fears, lady. Alex, the woman replied softly, her voice laced with both pride and hesitation. She took a small step forward, her hands nervously twisting the fabric of her dark blue gown. Alex Tully, Lady of Riverrun. Daenerys' expression softened, and she offered a small nod of recognition. Of course, she said with a kind smile. Lady Roslyn's niece. Yes, Your Grace, Alex confirmed, her cheeks coloring slightly at being addressed so directly. Edmure is no warrior, he never has been. But he will fight for us, for his family, for our children. Her voice faltered, and she glanced down, unable to meet Daenerys' gaze. And if he should fall, she paused, swallowing hard, her composure threatening to break. I have 3 children, Your Grace. My eldest son, Roderick, has not yet seen his 3rd name day. If anything should happen to his father, she trailed off, her voice cracking under the weight of her words. He is too young. They are all too young. Alex's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. The other women glanced at one another, their own fears reflected in Alex's trembling voice. Daenerys stepped closer, her gaze steady and full of compassion. Lady Alex, Daenerys said softly, your fears are not unfounded, and I will not dismiss them. No mother should have to worry for the safety of her children, nor for what will become of them should the worst happen. She placed a hand on Alex's arm, a small gesture of solidarity. But hear me when I say this, your children are the future of this kingdom. Their safety, their survival, this is what we fight for. And I promise you, we will do everything in our power to protect them. Alex looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Thank you, Your Grace, she whispered. But what if we cannot stop them? The dead, they do not care for oaths or promises. Daenerys's expression hardened with determination. You are right, my lady. The dead do not care for oaths, nor for crowns or thrones. But we who still draw breath, we care. We fight not just with swords and shields, but with love, with hope, and with resolve. And that is something the dead can never take from us. Alex nodded, her shoulders straightening slightly, as though Daenerys' words had lifted some of the weight she carried. Daenerys turned to address the rest of the women, her voice clear and strong. Every one of us has a part to play in the battles to come, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. Some will fight on the front lines. Others will fight by protecting those who cannot defend themselves, our children, our wounded, our future. We are all warriors in this fight, whether we wield a blade or cradle a child. And together, we will stand. Together, we will survive. The women in the hall murmured their agreement, their fear giving way to a quiet but growing resolve. Daenerys' words had sparked something in them, a sense of purpose that had been buried beneath their terror. She turned back to Alex, her hand still resting gently on the young woman's arm. Your children will be safe, Daenerys said firmly, her voice carrying a weight of reassurance that filled the great hall. Her violet eyes moved from face to face, taking in the tension, fear, and hope etched into the expressions of the women gathered before her. I offer you all a choice that is yours alone to make. The hall fell silent, the crackle of the hearths the only sound as Daenerys stepped forward, commanding the space with an air of quiet authority. Tomorrow, at first light, I will be sending carts back to White Harbor. These carts will carry supplies and messages, but they can also carry you and your children to safety. Dragonstone will act as a haven, a sanctuary for those who cannot or should not remain here. Princess Myrcella Martell holds the castle in my name and is prepared to receive you. She has made ready the halls and chambers of Dragonstone to house all who need refuge until the fighting is done. A ripple of whispers passed through the room, some women turning to their neighbors with wide eyes. Daenerys continued, her tone steady and unwavering. Some of you will choose to remain here and fight, she said. You may stand alongside your husbands, brothers, or kin, or wield a blade in your own right. Others among you may choose to stay as healers, tending to the wounded and keeping our strength alive. Both choices are noble and brave, and both are essential to our survival. But for those of you who wish to see your children safe from harm, who cannot bear the thought of them caught in the path of the dead, the choice is yours to make. She paused, letting her words settle. The firelight flickered across the women's faces, illuminating their turmoil and contemplation. I do not expect an answer now, Daenerys added. The carts will leave at first light. No one will judge your decision, whatever it may be. But know this, your courage is not measured by where you stand. It is measured by the love you hold for your families, for your people, and for this land. From the crowd, Alex Tully stepped forward again, her face pale but resolute. Your Grace, she said softly, her voice trembling only slightly, if I choose to stay, if I choose to send my children to Dragonstone but remain myself, who will protect them? How can I be sure they'll be safe? Daenerys turned to Alex, her expression warm but serious. I understand your fears, Lady Alex, she said. But I have placed Dragonstone in the hands of Princess Myrcella, who is both kind and strong. She has her own child to protect, and she understands the weight of this responsibility. The castle is well fortified and isolated by the sea. Your children will be as safe there as anywhere in the known world. Alex nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing a fraction. Others in the room began murmuring, their voices low but increasingly confident. A few women exchanged glances, silently debating their options. Please, Daenerys continued, addressing the room once more, do not let pride or fear of judgment weigh on your hearts. There is no shame in seeking safety for your children. There is no shame in choosing to fight here. The only shame is in doing nothing at all. Whatever you choose, you are still a part of this fight. You are still the heart of the North. From the back of the hall, Mage Mormont stepped forward with an unyielding look in her eyes. I'll stay and fight, my daughters too, she declared. The dead have no mercy, and I'll not sit idle while others face them. Daenerys smiled faintly but shifted her gaze to the gathered women. Lady Mormont has chosen her path, she said, her tone regal yet measured. Now, each of you must decide your own. Take the evening to think on it, speak to your husbands, your families, and one another. By dawn, let your choice be made. A ripple of murmurs passed through the group as the ladies curtsied and began to filter out, their whispers hushed as they exchanged quiet words. Some glanced back at the Queen as if searching for further reassurance, while others walked with resolute determination. Eventually, the great hall was nearly empty, save for Daenerys, Roslyn, Missandei, Sansa, and Arya. Sansa and Arya exchanged knowing glances before stepping forward to bid their formal farewells. Your Grace, Sansa said with a slight bow of her head, her voice as poised as ever. Thank you for allowing us to be part of this. We'll see you in the morning, Arya added, her tone more casual but no less respectful. Daenerys nodded, offering them a gracious smile. Good night, Lady Lannister. Lady Umber. The two sisters turned to leave, their cloaks trailing softly behind them. As they reached the doorway, they passed a figure stepping inside, a woman dressed in black and deep crimson, her presence striking yet subdued. Taita, Roslyn said warmly, her expression softening as she recognized her sister. Are you all right? Taita hesitated for a moment, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as though she were steeling herself for what she was about to say. I was hoping, she began timidly, her voice barely above a whisper, to be granted an audience with you and the Queen. Roslyn exchanged a brief look with Daenerys, who inclined her head slightly. Of course, Roslyn said gently. How can we help, Lady Taita? Daenerys regarded her with calm curiosity, her violet eyes studying Taita carefully. Bolton, Taita answered, the name falling from her lips like a stone dropping into still water. Though I was born Taita free. Roslyn stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on Taita's arm. My sister, she added softly to Daenerys. Taita swallowed hard, the weight of her words threatening to choke her. Her gaze dropped to the floor for a brief moment as if she were gathering the courage to continue, but then she forced herself to meet Daenerys's eyes again. I've heard tales of you, Your Grace, she began, her voice trembling at first, then steadily growing stronger. That you were sold to your first husband like a piece of property. I was the same. Daenerys's expression softened instantly, her violet eyes filled with a quiet understanding. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I was lucky, she said, her voice gentle but laced with a quiet sorrow. My first marriage grew into something far greater than I ever expected. But I know not all women are so fortunate. For many, marriage is nothing but a cage, and their husbands nothing but their jailers. I know the horrors that many women face. Her eyes darkened for a moment, and then she looked back at Taita, a flicker of something fierce behind her calm demeanor. Taita nodded, her fingers curling tightly into the fabric of her gown as the words from the past echoed in her mind. I've lived them, Your Grace. I was sold to Roose Bolton, a man twice my age, with no say in the matter. He wasn't just a husband, he was a stranger to me, cruel, calculating, a man who saw me as nothing but a means to an end. For years, I endured his cruelty, his manipulations, his games. Her voice quivered slightly, but she held herself together. She couldn't afford to crumble now. Not when she had come this far. I endured, and I had a daughter, but now, her eyes clouded, her throat tightening with emotion. Now, I'm afraid of what happens when the fighting is done. I've survived the dread fought, but what comes after? If my husband survives this war, what becomes of me? Of my children? Daenerys's gaze hardened as she listened, the pain in Taita's voice not lost on her. She took a step closer, her presence steadying, and gave Taita a look of deep sympathy. I understand your fear, Lady Taita, she said softly, her voice full of empathy. For so many of us, survival is not just a matter of battle, it's about surviving after the battle. surviving in a world that has seen us broken and crushed beneath the weight of men like Roose Bolton. Taita let out a slow, shaky breath. The walls she had built for so long, walls of stoicism and coldness, were beginning to crack, and the vulnerability she had tried to keep hidden for so many years surfaced. She took a step forward, her eyes meeting Daenerys's, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I cannot go back. My father is dead. But my daughter, she knows no life outside of the Dread Fort. She will be bound to the legacy of her father, to the name that she bears. And the thought of her living the life I did, under his shadow, Taita's voice broke, and she had to stop herself from crying, her throat tight with emotion. "It terrifies me, Your Grace. I don't know how to protect her from that. I don't even know if I can protect myself." Daenerys's expression remained calm, but there was a fire in her eyes now, a fire that had burned in her heart for many years. "You are not alone anymore, Lady Taita," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "You don't have to fight this battle alone. There is strength in numbers, in allies who understand your plight. If Roose Bolton falls, if this war turns in our favor, you will have a choice. You can leave the Dread Fort behind. You can leave the chains of that place and build a life for yourself. And for your daughter." Taita blinked rapidly, a tear slipping down her cheek that she quickly wiped away. She had lived so long in fear, in silence, never daring to hope for anything beyond mere survival. But here, in this moment, with Daenerys's quiet promise ringing in her ears, something inside her stirred. Something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. I want to believe that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But how do I begin again? How do I build a life when everything I know is tied to that cursed place? My daughter," she placed a hand over her stomach, her fingers splayed out across the small bump that had barely begun to show. "She'll never know freedom. She will always be tied to Roose's name, to his house. Even if I leave, she will never be free of that." Daenerys looked at Taita for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful, calculating, yet filled with a deep sense of conviction. "You will be free, Taita. You will decide what your daughter's name will mean. If you choose to leave the Dread Fort, you choose a new path. And if you choose to protect your children from the past, you have the strength to do so. Do not let the name you were born with dictate the life you are meant to lead." She paused, her voice lowering as she spoke with quiet authority. "You are not defined by Roose Bolton. You are defined by what you choose to become. And I swear to you, Lady Taita, I will help you every step of the way." Valar Morghulis Missandei said softly, her gaze steady as she spoke the ancient words. "All men must die." Daenerys finished, her voice calm, but there was something resolute in it as she met Missandei's eyes. Missandei nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, Your Grace. It is the way of the world." But Daenerys replied, her gaze hardening with determination, "We are not men." Notes. I'm happy to announce a spin-off mini-series to this story based on Taita, following her time at the Dread Fort. It's called Shadows of the Dread Fort and I'm hoping to have the first chapter up to tomorrow. It will be 10 chapters and is mostly written, I just need to review each chapter before posting. I had no plans to write this, but once I started, I literally couldn't stop and wrote the whole thing in 2 days. Hoping to be back on the main story soon. Chapter 68, Jon 6. Chapter text. Jon 6. It was late in the evening when Robb gathered his siblings in the Lord's office, the weight of the moment settling heavy over them. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the stone walls, its warmth barely touching the chill in the air. Outside, Winterfell was restless, servants packing what little they could, hushed conversations echoing through the halls, the tension of impending war thick as the frost creeping through the windows. Robb stood at the head of the room, shoulders squared, his face drawn with exhaustion, yet his voice was steady when he spoke. "I apologize for the lateness of the hour," he began, his tone quiet but firm. "I had hoped to speak with you all earlier, but the day ran away from me. It feels as though time is slipping through our fingers faster than we can catch it." His gaze swept over them before he continued. "Most of you will have already heard the Queen's offer, her promise to take in the non-fighting women and children, to bring them to safety on Dragonstone. I have agreed to send a small escort to ensure they make the journey unharmed. Enough to protect them, but not so many that we weaken ourselves further. He paused, his expression darkening. If we fall, those we send away may be all that remains of the North. A heavy silence followed his words. Sansa and Tyrion exchanged glances. Clearly, this was something they had already discussed. Arya shifted uncomfortably, arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. Behind her, Alan stood stiffly, uncertainty written all over his face. By the fire, Roslyn sat quietly beside Bran and Mira, her hands clasped in her lap. Bran, ever solemn, said nothing, but there was understanding in his eyes. Jon stood apart from them all, leaning against the far wall, his posture deceptively casual. He had known this moment was coming, yet it still twisted something inside him. Because, no matter how much he wanted to fight for this family, for this home, he knew the truth, he was not a Stark. Not truly. Robb exhaled slowly before speaking again. I wanted us to have this conversation together, as a family. Every chamber in Winterfell is filled with people making this same choice tonight, who stays, and who goes. Robb's blue-grey eyes swept across the room, waiting for their answers, though he already knew what most of them would say. Arya was the first to speak, her voice unwavering. We're Starks, brother, she said, lifting her chin defiantly. We're all staying here. There was no hesitation, no doubt. To Arya, there had never been another choice. Agreed, Roslyn added, her voice softer but just as firm. She reached out, placing a hand over Robb's, her touch warm despite the cold reality of what they were facing. Winterfell is where we stand. If it must be, Winterfell can be where we fall. But we do it together. Robb exhaled, nodding slightly. He had expected nothing less from her. And Torrhen, he asked, the name of his son heavy on his tongue. I've already spoken to Tyta, Roslyn said, her fingers tightening around his. She'll take him south. Her voice wavered only slightly, but she didn't let go. She'll keep him safe. Robb swallowed hard and gave a small nod. It was the right choice, the only choice. But gods, it still hurt. We've decided to stay too, Sansa said, glancing at Tyrion beside her. Tyrion let out a small huff, shaking his head with a wry smile. It's bad enough being the only Lannister on our side, he said dryly. I can't very well run away when the battle is actually here. Imagine the terrible reputation I'd gain. Despite the gravity of the moment, Sansa allowed herself a faint smile, and even Arya let out the ghost of a scoff. The weight of the decision before them loomed large, but stubbornness had always been a Stark trait, and none of them were willing to bow beneath it. After a pause, Sansa turned to Roslyn, her grip tightening around Tyrion's hand. Do you think your sister would watch over Daemon as well? Her voice was careful, measured, but the way her fingers curled around Tyrion's betrayed the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. Roslyn met her gaze with quiet understanding. I'm sure she would be honored, she said gently. Robb exhaled, his expression clouded with a mixture of frustration and reluctant acceptance. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that at least some of his family would take the safer path. But deep down, he knew better. The women of his house were not ones to be sheltered away. Fine, he said finally, rubbing a weary hand over his face. But if you're staying, I will do everything in my power to keep you safe. You can stay in the crypts. No, Roslyn stood, her chin lifting defiantly. I will be with the Maesters, tending the wounded. Roslyn, Robb said, a warning in his tone. No, she interrupted, her voice firm and unwavering. I will not sit hidden away while you and every other man in this castle fight and die for me. I will help in the way I can. Robb's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. I'll be with Tyrion on the battlements, Sansa added, her voice calm but resolute. If things get bad on the ground, we can coordinate the defense from within the keep. And I'm going to fight, Arya said. No, Robb said immediately, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jon pushed himself off the wall, arms crossed over his chest. Arya. Wife, Alan began, stepping towards her. No, Arya cut them all off, her voice sharp as steel. I agree with Roslyn. I won't sit in the dark waiting for someone else to die in my place. I was never good at stitching, so I doubt I'd be of much use to the Maesters. She lifted her chin, her grey eyes burning with determination. But what I can do is hold a sword. Robb pinched the bridge of his nose, but before he could launch into a protest, Bran's quiet voice cut through the room. She won't change her mind, he said. His gaze, distant yet knowing, settled on Arya. And she's right. She can fight. Robb exhaled sharply. This isn't a game, Arya. Arya scoffed. I know that better than anyone. A tense silence followed, heavy with unspoken fears and lingering doubts. Robb looked between them all, his heart warring between his duty as their leader and his instinct to protect them as their brother. Robb exhaled, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. His voice, when he finally spoke, was edged with reluctant acceptance. Robb exhaled, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. His voice, when he finally spoke, was edged with reluctant acceptance. Robb exhaled, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. His voice, when he finally spoke, was edged with reluctant acceptance. Fine, he said, his tone betraying the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones. You're all free to go. I'll see you at breakfast. The room slowly emptied as they left in pairs, the unspoken tension still lingering between them. Sansa and Tyrion were the first to go, her fingers still laced tightly with his as they exchanged hushed words just beyond the door. Arya and Alicent followed, their heads bowed close together in quiet conversation, though Arya's sharp gaze flickered back toward Robb before she disappeared down the hall. Bran and Meera lingered only a moment longer. Meera moved behind his chair, her hands firm on the worn wooden handles, but Bran didn't need her to speak for him. He met Robb's gaze, his expression unreadable, his eyes shadowed with something deeper than concern, something knowing. He held the look for just a second longer, as though searching for something in his brother's face, before he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then Meera turned the chair and guided him from the room, their footsteps fading into the corridor. Only Jon, Robb, and Roslyn remained. Robb turned to Roslyn, his voice dropping low enough that Jon couldn't make out his words. Whatever he said made her hesitate, her brows drawing together in concern, before she sighed and stepped closer, pressing a quick kiss to his cheek. She rested a hand against his chest, murmuring something too soft for Jon to catch, then turned toward the door. As she passed Jon, she gave him a swift nod, her expression unreadable, before vanishing into the corridor, leaving only the two brothers behind in the flickering torchlight. Jon watched Roslyn disappear into the corridor, the door closing softly behind her, leaving only the crackling of the fire between him and Robb. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Robb took a seat, his forearms braced against his knees, fingers laced together, staring at the ground as though he might find answers hidden in the stone floor. His jaw was tight, tension radiating from every part of him, and Jon knew his brother well enough to see that he was holding something back. Jon exhaled, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. What did you say to her? Robb didn't look up. It doesn't matter. Jon huffed a quiet laugh, humorless. I think it does. At that, Robb finally lifted his gaze, and the weight of it was almost enough to make Jon regret pressing. Almost. I asked her to leave, Robb admitted, his voice low. One last time. I told her she didn't have to stay. That she shouldn't. His lips pressed into a thin line. She refused. Again. Jon studied him for a moment, weighing his next words carefully. She's your wife, he said at last. Did you really think she'd go? Robb exhaled sharply, something between a laugh and a scoff, but there was no real amusement in it. He dragged a hand down his face, the weight of the conversation pressing heavily on his shoulders. No, he admitted. But I had to try. Silence stretched between them, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows along the stone walls. Then, after a moment, Robb shook his head, his sharp blue-grey eyes settling on Jon with something unreadable beneath them. And what about you? He asked, voice quieter now but no less firm. You didn't say much back there. Not really. Jon frowned. About what? Robb leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, fingers laced together. They're your sisters as much as they're mine, he said, his tone carrying something heavier than mere frustration. Do you really want Arya fighting alongside us? Jon sighed, running a hand through his hair before crossing his arms over his chest. Do you really think there was anything anyone could have said to get her to change her mind? Robb let out another breath, shaking his head again, slower this time. No, he admitted. But that doesn't mean I have to like it. Jon understood. The thought of Arya in the middle of a battle, steel flashing in her hand, surrounded by blood and death, made his stomach twist uncomfortably. But it was Arya. She had never been one to sit by and watch, never content with being protected. She had fought her whole life to be seen as an equal, to be taken seriously, and she would fight for this too. She's not a little girl anymore, Jon said, his voice gruff. She can hold her own. Robb let out a bitter chuckle. That doesn't make it any easier. He shook his head again, pressing his lips into a thin line. The idea of her out there, in the thick of it, if something happens to her, he cut himself off, exhaling sharply. Jon understood that too. If Arya fell, if Sansa did, if any of them did, none of it was something they could bear to think about. But war didn't care about what they could or couldn't stomach. Robb inhaled deeply, straightening. And Sansa, he said. You're not worried about her? Jon's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing at his sides before curling into fists. Of course I am, he said, his voice gruff with restrained emotion. But she's got Tyrion. And she's smart. Smarter than most. If things turn, she'll know what to do. Robb studied him for a long moment, his expression still lined with unease. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows along the stone walls, but the warmth it gave did nothing to touch the cold dread settling between them. Slowly, Robb nodded, though it was clear the answer hadn't soothed him. Nothing could, not really. I hate this, he muttered, his voice quiet but raw. Every second of it. Jon didn't reply. There was nothing to say. They could talk in circles all night, but it wouldn't change what was coming. The battle loomed over them, heavy and inevitable, and all they could do now was wait. Robb let out a breath, squared his shoulders, then reached out, giving Jon a firm tap on the shoulder. Sleep well, brother. Jon only nodded. He doubted sleep would come, but there was no use admitting it. Robb turned towards his chambers, shoulders stiff with the weight of responsibility, while Jon remained standing for a moment longer, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He had struggled to sleep since he'd come back from the dead. There was something about the quiet of the night that unsettled him now, the silence too empty, the darkness too vast. The cold of the northern air no longer bit at his skin as it once had, but neither did the heat of a fire warm him. It was as though he existed somewhere in between, caught in a space that was neither truly living nor entirely dead. With a sigh, he turned on his heel and made his way out of the keep. The courtyard was still, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots. Above him, the sky stretched vast and endless, the stars burning bright, distant, indifferent. His feet carried him towards the Godswood before he even made the decision to go. It was instinct, some part of him that still clung to the old ways, to the place where the weirwood tree stood like a silent guardian of all that had come before. He expected to be alone. But as he stepped past the ancient branches, the red leaves rustling softly in the night breeze, he saw her. Daenerys Targaryen knelt at the base of the weirwood, her silver hair almost blending in with the snow and the white bark, her head bowed, her hands resting gently on the roots. For a moment, he simply watched her, surprised. She looked different like this, softer, smaller somehow, as if the weight of her titles and crowns had been set aside, leaving only the woman beneath. The queen who had crossed the world on the back of dragons, who had survived fire and betrayal, was kneeling before the old gods of the north. Jon took a step closer, his voice quiet in the hush of the Godswood. I didn't think you'd still be awake, Your Grace. Daenerys lifted her head slightly at the sound of his voice, though she did not turn to face him. Her fingers continued tracing the rough bark of the weirwood's roots. Neither did I, she murmured. I fear the cold may keep me from my rest for a while. Until I get used to it. Jon huffed a quiet breath, something almost like a laugh. You may not believe this, Your Grace, but a night spent in Winterfell is amongst the warmest I've ever had. That earned him the faintest tilt of her lips, though it was brief, fleeting like a flicker of candlelight. He took a few more steps, coming to stand beside her, his gaze following hers to the solemn face carved into the pale trunk, its deep red leaves rustling softly in the wind. She exhaled softly, her breath visible in the cold air. I wanted to see it, she admitted. The heart tree. I've heard stories of the old gods, of this place. Her fingers brushed against the gnarled roots. It's different from what I've known. I haven't had the best luck with ancient gods, maybe these will be different. John nodded, understanding more than he could put into words. The Godswood had always been a place of quiet reverence, a connection to something greater than oneself. Daenerys finally turned her gaze to him, her violet eyes searching his. Do you believe they are watching? The old gods. John hesitated, glancing back at the tree. Maybe. She studied him for a moment, then looked away. I don't know which gods listen to me anymore, she said quietly. If any do at all. John frowned at that, at the quiet ache in her voice. He sank to his knees beside her, resting his hands on his thighs. The silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. If anything, it felt necessary. After a long moment, John spoke, his voice low, steady. Maybe it's not about them listening. Maybe it's about us speaking. Daenerys glanced at him, and something in her gaze softened, just a little. John wasn't sure why he'd said it, only that it felt true. There were no certainties in war, no guarantees of survival. Tomorrow, they could all be ash and bone beneath a blooded sky. But maybe, here in the quiet of the Godswood, beneath the watchful, carved gaze of the weirwood, they could find something rare. A moment of understanding. Daenerys let the silence linger between them, stretching like the shadows cast by the moonlight through the red leaves. Then, finally, she spoke. I've heard what they say about you, she said softly. About what happened to you. John remained still, his expression giving nothing away. He wasn't surprised. Of course people talked. Death was something unnatural when it reversed itself. He was an oddity, a whispered legend wrapped in mystery, much like her. I wouldn't know what they say, Your Grace, he replied, his voice even. I only know what I lived. She turned to him, her gaze piercing in the dim glow of the torches beyond the trees. And what did you live? John hesitated, his breath misting in the cold air. He had never spoken of it, not really. Not in the way she was asking. But here, under the ancient branches of the heart tree, with only her and the gods as his witness, he found himself considering it. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then, with a quiet exhale, he said, I died. I was executed for treason. His voice was calm, but there was something deeper beneath the words, something raw. I felt the blade. I felt the cold. The nothingness. Daenerys' brows furrowed, but she didn't interrupt. John looked away, back at the weirwood. And then I came back. He shook his head slightly. But not all of me. There it was, the thing he never said aloud. The truth that clung to him like a shadow. Daenerys studied him, her expression unreadable. What do you mean? John swallowed, considering his next words carefully. I don't feel things the same way I used to, he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost lost to the wind. I don't know if it was the cold of the grave or the hands that pulled me from it, but something was left behind. Daenerys was silent for a long time, but when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. I know what it is to lose parts of yourself, she murmured. To have fire burn away what was once whole. John turned to look at her again, surprised by the quiet honesty in her tone. She wasn't just speaking of war, of conquest. She was speaking of something more personal, something deeper. For the first time since she had arrived in the north, standing beneath the old god's watchful gaze, John felt like he was speaking to Daenerys, not the queen, not the conqueror, not the dragon. Just her. She hesitated only a moment before speaking. Can I see? Her voice was not timid, but kind, curious rather than demanding. If I saw your scars, perhaps I could begin to truly believe it. To understand. John raised a brow. Are you calling me a liar, Your Grace? His lips curved into a rare chuckle, a dry warmth in the cold night air. Her eyes widened slightly. No. Of course not, she said quickly, flustered at the thought that she had offended him. I just mean, she trailed off, watching as he shifted, undoing the laces of his thick black cloak before shrugging it off. The movement was slow, deliberate, the soft rustle of fabric the only sound between them. His jerkin followed, then the linen shirt beneath, until he was bare from the waist up, the cold air doing nothing to raise a shiver from his skin. Daenerys did not speak as she moved closer, her gaze sweeping over him. The moonlight bathed him in silver, outlining the defined planes of his chest, the broad strength of his shoulders. But it was the scars that held her attention, the places where blade and fire and betrayal had marked him beyond just the occasion that he had lost his life. Her fingers hovered just above his skin before she let them brush lightly along the raised ridge of the wound at his throat, the one where the executioner's axe had struck true. The Red Woman's magic had put him back together, but not without leaving reminders. Some wounds healed, others never truly did. This should have been impossible, she murmured, tracing the thin, pale scar where his head had parted from his body. Her touch was feather-light, reverent almost. And yet, here you stand. Jon let out a quiet breath. I. His voice was low, edged with something unreadable. Here I stand. Daenerys studied him for a long moment, as if committing the sight of him, his scars, his survival, to memory. Then, slowly, her fingers traced lower, moving over the fainter scars that crisscrossed his chest, marks left behind by blades that had once threatened to end him but never quite succeeded. The sensation of her touch against his bare skin sent a ripple of sensation through him, more feeling than he had experienced in months, years, even. It was as if he had spent so long being numb, surrounded by cold, by death, that he had forgotten what it meant to be touched by someone who wasn't trying to kill him. Her fingers were light but deliberate, tracing lines over his skin, as if she were mapping the story of his survival with nothing but her fingertips. His breath hitched slightly at her touch, though he wasn't sure if she noticed. Or perhaps she did, and simply chose not to acknowledge it. Jon had never been a fool, and he would have been blind not to see the beauty in the woman standing before him. The moonlight turned her silver hair into a cascade of pale fire, her violet eyes sharp, searching, but filled with something softer now. He had thought of her as a force of nature, something untouchable, like the dragons she rode. But in this moment, she was something else entirely. And as her fingers lingered against his skin, tracing along the deep scars over his heart, he had the flickering thought that maybe, just maybe, she was interested in him for something more than just the impossibility of his survival. Jon cleared his throat. You should get some rest, Your Grace. It'll be a long day tomorrow. But Daenerys didn't move. She let out a quiet breath, her gaze dropping back to his chest, to the pale marks crisscrossing his skin. You've suffered so much, she said. And yet you keep going. Why? Jon hesitated. Because I have to. Not because you want to. Jon didn't know how to answer her. His whole life had been dictated by duty, by honor, by loyalty, by the weight of expectations that had never truly belonged to him. Whether at Winterfell, at the Wall, or beyond it, he had always chosen what was right over what he wanted. But here, in the stillness of the Godswood, with Daenerys standing so close, he felt something shift. A strand of silver blonde hair had fallen loose across her cheek. Before he could stop himself, his hand moved, his fingers brushing against her skin as he tucked it gently behind her ear. She inhaled sharply at the touch, but she didn't pull away. Neither did he. His palm lingered, cupping her face, his thumb ghosting over her cheekbone. She was warm beneath his touch, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt something other than the cold. Daenerys tilted her head slightly, leaning into his touch, her eyes searching his with an openness he had rarely seen from her. The Dragon Queen, the conqueror, the breaker of chains, she was none of those things in this moment. She was just a woman standing before him, and he was just a man. And God's help him, he wanted to kiss her. The realization hit him like a blow. The secret he had buried deep, the truth he had told himself didn't matter, now, in this moment, it had never mattered more. He wasn't Jon Snow, the unimportant bastard of Winterfell. Not in his blood, not in his bones. He was Jaehaerys Targaryen, son of Rhaegar, her nephew. The weight of it crashed down on him, and his hand fell away as though burned. He stepped back, jaw tightening, heart hammering in his chest. Daenerys frowned, confusion flickering across her face. Jon. He exhaled sharply. He couldn't find the words. She studied him, something unspoken passing between them. And then, as if sensing the shift in him, she straightened, drawing herself back into the composed, unshaken queen he had first met. "Good night, John." Her voice was softer now, almost hesitant, as though she, too, felt the weight of something unspoken hanging between them. John swallowed, forcing himself to nod once. "Good night, Your Grace." Then, before he could let himself hesitate, before he could betray the war raging inside him, he turned and walked away. Each step felt heavier than the last. The cold night air should have cleared his mind, but it did the opposite. His thoughts were filled with her, her warmth, her touch, the way she had leaned into him as though she belonged there. As though he belonged to her. And for one fleeting moment, he had wanted to believe it. His fists clenched at his sides. He had to fight every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to go to her, to reassure her that she wasn't imagining things, that he had felt it too. But he knew better. Even if they weren't who they were, Targaryen blood, aunt and nephew, she still deserved better than him. He had given up the right to love, to want, the day he died. What was he now, if not a living corpse? A shadow of the man he had once been. She was fire, and he was cold, and the longer he let himself forget that, the worse it would hurt when the truth finally burned them both. John made it back into the courtyard, his breath misting in the chill, his head still warring with itself when he heard hurried footsteps against the stone. A young servant boy came rushing down from the Ravelry, his thin frame nearly swallowed by the oversized cloak he wore. He clutched a tattered bit of parchment in his hands, his face pale and drawn. "My lord! My lord!" the boy called, voice cracking with urgency. John tensed. "Are you trying to wake the whole castle?" he hissed in hushed tones, snatching the letter from the boy's hands. "And for the last time, I'm no lord." The boy hesitated. "I'm sorry, my lord," he caught himself. "A letter from Castle Black." John barely heard him. His fingers had already broken the seal, his eyes scanning the rough, hastily scrawled words. Each sentence tightened his chest like a vice. "The wall has fallen. The dead will reach you in a week. The Red Witch's death let them pass. Only half a dozen men survived. We ride for Winterfell. Pray that we reach you first. May the gods save all of our souls. Gendry Waters." John's hands curled around the parchment, his breath a sharp, frozen thing in his throat. It was real. No more waiting, no more time for second guessing. They were coming. John's grip tightened around the parchment, his jaw clenching as a cold dread settled deep in his bones. The boy shifted nervously beside him. "Do I wake Lord Stark?" he asked, voice small, uncertain. John exhaled sharply, his decision made in an instant. "Wake the whole bloody keep." Chapter 69, John 7. Chapter text. John 7. The news spread through Winterfell like wildfire, carried on hushed whispers and hurried footsteps. The dead were coming. The wall had fallen. The battle they had feared for so long was no longer distant, it was upon them. Winterfell became a hive of movement, every soul inside its walls set to work. The smiths hammered away at weapons, reforging steel and fitting dragon glass into hilts. The courtyards were crowded with men and women sparring, drilling, preparing for a fight that few expected to survive. Women and children were roused from their beds, hurriedly ushered into the courtyard where Rosalind stood, guiding them into the wagons. They were meant to leave at first light, but with time slipping through their fingers, they would now depart under the cover of darkness, while they still had the chance. Robb Stark stood at the high table in the great hall, the map of the north spread before him, candlelight flickering against his drawn features. John stood beside him, hands braced on the table, staring at the markers that represented their armies. "They could be here in less than a week," John said. "If the storm holds them back, maybe a little longer. We need every man in position by then." "We'll form 3 defensive lines," Robb said. "The first will hold the outer gates as long as possible. The second will fall back to the walls if the first is broken. And the third," he exhaled sharply, tracing a line along the inner bailey. "The third is our last stand." Silence hung between them for a long moment. A last stand. They both knew what that meant. John nodded. "We should use the dragons to clear the field whenever we have a concentrated mass of them. But I won't risk our men getting caught in the fire." "I'll speak with Daenerys," Robb said, though there was still a flicker of unease in his expression. The thought of relying on dragons did not sit easily with him. Her forces need to be fully integrated into our defense. We can't have separate armies fighting their own battles, we won't survive like that. She knows that, John replied, his voice firm. She wants to win this war just as much as we do. Robb exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Then let's make sure everyone else knows it too. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the map of Winterfell spread before them. Go. Check in with the others. We need to be certain everything is in place, I will not be taken by surprise. John gave a curt nod before turning on his heel and striding from the hall. The keep was alive with hurried movement, armor being fitted, weapons being sharpened, carts being loaded with supplies. He passed the courtyard, where Roslyn was still ushering the last of the women and children into wagons, her face lined with quiet determination, as she closed the rear gate and watched as the last wagon rolled out for the courtyard, following the dozen that had already left. But he didn't stop. There was no time. He found Sansa and Tyrion in the far end of the courtyard, surrounded by stacks of food, blankets, and barrels of water. Sansa had quill and parchment in hand, issuing orders to the steward while Tyrion counted through the supply ledgers with a scrutinizing eye. "How are we looking?" Jon asked, stepping closer. Sansa barely glanced up. "We'll have enough food for those who remain, if the battle doesn't last more than a week or so. If it stretches longer," she shook her head. "We'll have to ration more strictly." Tyrion closed the ledger with a sigh. "The good news is, the wine will hold. If we're all to die, at least we won't do so sober." Jon shot him a look, unimpressed. "I'm joking," Tyrion muttered, tucking the book under his arm. "Mostly." Jon turned back to Sansa. "The dragons will be used strategically. No constant fire. Only when the dead are gathered in numbers large enough to make it worth the risk." She nodded, still writing. "That's good. I'd rather not have Winterfell burned down before the dead even reach our walls." Jon studied her for a moment. She was composed, focused, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped her quill too tightly. "And you?" he asked, voice quieter now. "How are you holding up?" Sansa finally looked at him then, her blue eyes searching his. "Ask me again in a week," she said, offering the faintest hint of a smile. Jon gave a short nod. "I will." Then he glanced at Tyrion. "Keep her safe." Tyrion dipped his head. "That, my dear brother-in-law, is the only order I intend to follow to the letter." Satisfied, Jon turned to leave, but Sansa's voice stopped him. "Jon." He looked back. Sansa's voice was gentle but firm. "You should rest. Whatever's coming, you'll need your strength." Jon hesitated. He knew she was right, but rest felt impossible when doom hung so heavily over them. Every hour spent trying to sleep was an hour wasted when death itself was marching towards them. Still, he gave her the smallest of nods before stepping away. Leaving the great hall behind, he made his way through the courtyard, weaving between men preparing for battle. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and burning wood, the sounds of a keep bracing for war. But Jon's gaze was drawn beyond the gates, where the Unsullied were running drills in the open field. He crossed the threshold, boots crunching against the frost-bitten ground. The training ground was a stark contrast to the disorder of Winterfell's courtyard. Here, Grey Worm stood at the front of his soldiers, his voice cutting through the cold as he barked orders. The Unsullied moved in perfect synchronization, their spears rising and falling in flawless unison. But behind them, in a more ragged formation, stood the northern small folk who had volunteered to fight. Jon watched as they struggled to keep up, their movements slow and uncertain. Young boys barely old enough to lift a sword wobbled beneath the weight of dragon-glass spears, their grips too loose, their stances all wrong. Some of the older men fared little better. Jon suppressed a grimace as one lad nearly dropped his weapon entirely, earning a sharp rebuke from one of the Unsullied trainers. He sighed. These men were not warriors. They were farmers, blacksmiths, stable hands. But they would fight, because they had no choice. At the front, beyond Grey Worm and the disciplined ranks of the Unsullied, stood Daenerys. She watched the training with sharp eyes, her arms folded, her silver hair catching in the moonlight. Beside her, Varys stood with his hands clasped before him, his expression unreadable. Barristan Selmy stood just behind them, his hand resting lightly on the pommel of his sword. Jon made his way towards them, his eyes lingering on Daenerys. She looked every inch the queen, poised, composed, but there was something else there too, beneath the steel in her expression. A weight. A burden. As if she felt his gaze, she turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes. Something flickered across her face, relief, perhaps, or something softer, but it was gone in an instant. Lord Snow Varys greeted him smoothly as Jon approached. "Come to inspect the troops." Jon barely spared him a glance before focusing on Daenerys. "How are they?" She exhaled slowly. "The Unsullied will hold the lines," she said. "They know their purpose." "But the Northerners," she trailed off, her gaze shifting back to the struggling men in the field. "They are trying," Jon said. "They are dying," Barristan corrected, his voice grave. "If they fight like this, they won't last 5 minutes." Jon clenched his jaw. He couldn't argue with that. "They need more training," Daenerys said, her tone edged with frustration. "More time." "We don't have time," Jon replied. "The dead will be here in a week." She turned to him, her violet eyes dark with frustration and reluctant acceptance. There was no argument to be had, no solution to fix it. "Then we do what we can with the time we have," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Her gaze swept over the field once more before she spoke again, her voice sharp with authority. "Sir Barristan, please seek out Edmure Tully and Harry Hardung. I've noticed none of their men have joined us this morning. Perhaps Lord Snow can explain the absence of the northern soldiers." Jon met her gaze, sensing the challenge in her words. "Our trained men are needed elsewhere this morning, Your Grace," he said evenly. "But they will join the training from now on, you have my word." Daenerys said nothing, only turned her attention back to the struggling fighters. Jon let the silence linger for a beat before speaking again. "I do fail to see the Dothraki on the training yard, though, Your Grace." His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it, a quiet challenge. "The Dothraki need no training, Lord Snow," she bit back, her tone firm. "When the battle comes, they will hit where it counts. I won't waste their time." Her gaze snapped to his, unyielding. "Sir Barristan, if you please." The older knight inclined his head. "Of course, Your Grace," he said before striding away. Daenerys shifted her focus to Varys next. "Lord Varys, I want to meet with Lord Tyrion in an hour. Ensure he has everything I need prepared." "It would be my honor, Your Grace," Varys said smoothly. With a short bow, he too turned and left. And then they were alone. The sounds of the training yard surrounded them, footsteps scuffing against packed earth, the dull thud of weapons meeting shields, Grey Worm's curt commands in his thick accent, but between them, there was only silence. Finally, he exhaled, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "I wanted to apologize, Your Grace." Daenerys did not look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the soldiers before them, her expression unreadable. "Whatever for?" she asked, her voice carefully devoid of emotion. Jon hesitated, but forced himself to continue. "My behavior last night. It was unfair of me." "There's no need, Lord Snow," she interrupted, her tone firm. "I think we both know we were acting out of character. There is nothing to apologize for." Jon turned his head slightly, studying her. There was something in her voice, something too controlled, too measured. She was putting distance between them, and he knew why. It was the same reason he had walked away from her in the Godswood. Still, he wasn't ready to let it go. "I just thought," he began again. Daenerys finally looked at him then, her violet eyes sharp, searching. "Thought what?" she asked, and for the first time, there was something real in her voice. Something unguarded. Jon swallowed. He wasn't sure what he'd thought. That she felt the same pull he did. That, despite everything, despite her title, their burdens, the truth he couldn't bring himself to tell her, they could have something real. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer, but it was one he could never say aloud. Instead, he looked away, back to the training field. "Nothing," he said finally. "It doesn't matter." Daenerys studied him for a moment longer before nodding, as if she had expected that answer. "Then we should get back to work," she said. And just like that, the conversation was over. Daenerys turned without another word, her white cloak catching in the cold breeze, the silver embroidery shimmering under the weak winter sun. She didn't look back as she strode away, her posture straight, composed, regal, unshaken. Jon let out a quiet, frustrated noise, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to speak with her, truly speak with her, not as a queen or as a soldier, but as two people standing on the precipice of something neither of them could afford to fall into. But the weight of duty pressed against them both, holding them apart. He sighed, rolling his shoulders, ready to turn away. And then he heard it. A quiet, stifled laugh from above. Jon's head snapped up toward the battlements, just in time to catch a glimpse of movement, a dark shape ducking out of sight. "Arya Stark," he called, suspicion tinged with amusement. "Aren't you a bit old now for eavesdropping?" For a moment, silence. Then the sound of light, hurried footsteps on stone. "I don't know what you mean, brother." Arya's voice rang out, feigning innocence as she sprinted away. Jon swore under his breath and moved fast, slipping through the inner gate and into the courtyard before she could disappear into the keep. He cut across the yard, boots crunching over packed snow and mud, and reached the stone steps just as Arya leapt down the last few. She skidded to a halt when she saw him, half out of breath, half laughing. "You've gotten slow," she teased, smirking up at him. Jon folded his arms, tilting his head. "Maybe you've just got faster. Since when have you been spying on me?" Arya shrugged, still grinning, her grey eyes glinting with mischief. "Hard not to when you're making moon eyes at the Dragon Queen in the middle of the yard." Jon exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "I wasn't." Arya raised an eyebrow. "It's not like that," he amended, scowling. Her smirk only grew. "Right. And I suppose last night in the Godswood was just two allies discussing tactics." Jon stiffened. "You." Arya tapped the side of her nose. "You're not the only one who knows how to move quietly, Jon." Jon swore again, rubbing a hand over his face. "You tell anyone." Arya rolled her eyes. "Relax," she interrupted. "I'm not Sansa." Jon stilled, his frown deepening. "What's that supposed to mean?" For the first time, Arya hesitated. It was brief, a flicker of something in her eyes, barely noticeable, but Jon caught it. When she spoke again, her voice was more measured, less playful. "It means she sees things differently," she said carefully. "She's thinking about alliances. Power. What Daenerys means for the North." Jon exhaled sharply through his nose. That wasn't surprising. Sansa had spent too long playing the game to ignore its pieces now. She would see Daenerys not just as a queen, but as a factor, something to be managed, controlled, leveraged. Jon didn't have the patience for it. So he shifted the subject. "And what does your husband think you're doing whilst you're off lurking in the dark?" The change in Arya was immediate. Her expression froze, all trace of amusement vanishing. She started, then stopped, her lips pressing together. Jon's brows drew together. He had expected a snarky remark, some quip about Alan knowing better than to question her, or maybe a jab about how marriage had unchanged her. Instead, she looked, caught. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less pointed. "Happy to pry into my private life, but I'm not allowed to know about yours." Arya's jaw tightened, and for a second, he thought she might lash out, might deflect with some sharp remark meant to cut him down and shut him up. But then she let out a slow breath and looked away. "It's complicated," she muttered. Jon crossed his arms. "Is it?" She glared at him, but there was no real fire in it. "I didn't come here to talk about me," she said, her voice clipped. "Then maybe you shouldn't have brought up Daenerys," Jon shot back. Arya's lips twitched, not quite a smirk, but close. "Fair enough." For a moment, they stood there, the weight of unspoken words between them. Then Arya shifted, stepping back. "Don't spend too much time thinking about what you can't have," she said. "It'll drive you mad." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jon alone with far too much to think about. He stood there long after Arya had gone, her words gnawing at the edges of his mind. Don't spend too much time thinking about what you can't have. It'll drive you mad. If only she knew. If only she understood the weight of what he carried. It wasn't just Daenerys. It was everything, the truth of his name, his blood, the way it threatened to upend everything he had ever known. He could not stop thinking about it, no matter how much he tried. It was a ghost that followed him through the halls of Winterfell, whispering in the quiet moments, pulling at him in ways he did not know how to fight. He had never wanted to be anyone but Jon Snow. A bastard, an outcast, a man with no place but the one he carved for himself. But now he was Jaehaerys Targaryen, heir to a throne he did not want, bound by blood to the woman who had begun to feel like something more than a queen to him. His feet carried him without thought, away from the battlements, away from the noise of the courtyard where men still trained, where swords clashed and orders were shouted. He needed air, space, something to quiet the storm inside him. Before he knew it, he was back at the Godswood. The weirwood stood silent in the moonlight, its red leaves shifting gently in the wind. Jon placed a hand against its pale trunk, grounding himself in its presence. What am I supposed to do? The old gods did not answer. The days slipped through their fingers like sand, both dragging endlessly and vanishing too quickly. Each morning began the same, training at first light, blades clashing in the courtyard, men and women pushing themselves to exhaustion. Blacksmiths toiled through the afternoons, forging as many weapons from dragon glass as they could manage until there was nothing left to shape. The food stores had been counted, recounted, then checked once more. The great hall had been stripped of its feasting tables and transformed into a makeshift sick bay, stocked with linens, bandages, and whatever meager healing supplies they could gather. Every task that could be done had been done. And still, the enemy did not come. Jon felt the weight of waiting more keenly than anything else. The silence pressed in on them, thick and heavy, making every passing hour feel like a breath held too long. In a strange way, he almost wished for them to come already, to end this agonizing limbo, to meet the fight head-on instead of sitting in its looming shadow. Then, 2 days before the dead were due to arrive, the storm came. A blizzard unlike any Jon had ever seen, even beyond the wall. The wind howled through the trees with an eerie, unrelenting wail, rattling the shutters and slamming against the walls of Winterfell as if the storm itself were trying to claw its way inside. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, piling against the gates, burying the courtyard in a matter of hours. Training ceased. The forges went cold. No one could leave the keep without risking getting lost in the white abyss. Winterfell, so full of purpose and movement only a day before, had fallen into a tense, uneasy stillness. Inside, the fires burned hot, but they did little to keep away the chill that had settled into their bones. People huddled together in the halls, whispering, waiting. The tension thickened like ice on the walls, and Jon could feel it tightening around him, coiling like a snake in his gut. He had spent his life in the north. He knew storms. But this was unnatural. This was not a blizzard sent by the gods. This was the work of the dead. They were close now. Closer than ever. And all they could do was wait. Jon kept his distance from Daenerys. It was easier that way. Safer. He spent his days with his siblings, checking in on Sansa as she ensured supplies were rationed properly, sparring with Arya when she grew restless, watching over Bran as he sat by the fire, lost in thought. But even as he buried himself in family, she was still there, always there, like a ghost lingering just at the edge of his vision. They would catch each other staring across the hall, across the training yard, across the war room. Fleeting moments where their eyes would meet and something would crackle in the space between them. But neither spoke. Neither dared. When Jon needed to pass a message to her, he went through Tyrion. A formality. An excuse. Anything to keep from standing too close, from falling into old patterns. Tyrion, for his part, seemed to find the whole arrangement amusing. "You do realize she's not an invading army, don't you?" he had said once, swirling his wine with a knowing look. "You don't have to act as though speaking to her might bring about the end of the world." Jon had not dignified him with a response. He couldn't afford to. Because it wasn't speaking to Daenerys that he feared. It was everything else. The pull he felt whenever she was near. The heat that lingered between them despite the cold. The truth of who he was, pressing against his ribs like a blade waiting to pierce through his skin. If she knew, if she found out what he had been hiding, what would happen then? He told himself that keeping his distance was for the best. That avoiding her was the only way to keep the truth from shattering whatever fragile alliance they still had. But as the storm raged on and the enemy drew nearer, the silence between them only grew louder. At night, Rob tried to keep spirits high among the men. They drank late into the evening, played games, told stories, anything to keep the fear at bay. John joined them when he could, sharing quiet laughs over cups of mead, watching as battle-hardened men clung to whatever normalcy they could find. When the dead came, titles wouldn't matter. Lords and common soldiers alike would stand together, fighting not for crowns or causes but simply to live. It was late when John finally excused himself, retreating to the quiet of his chambers. He was weary but knew sleep would not come easily. It rarely did these days. He began undressing, pulling off his furs, unbuckling his sword belt, when a sudden knock at the door made him pause. Frowning, he crossed the room, pulling the door open, only to find Daenerys standing there. She was dressed simply, without the heavy embroidery or dragon-forged jewelry she often wore. A thick cloak was wrapped tightly around her, her silver hair unbraided, tumbling loose over her shoulders. There was something different about her in the dim candlelight, less like a queen, more like a woman caught in the same endless waiting as everyone else. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, her voice quiet but steady. John's grip tightened on the edge of the door. He had spent days keeping his distance, convincing himself it was the right thing to do, and yet here she was. And he could not bring himself to turn her away. He stepped aside. "Come in." John stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She moved past him with careful steps, her cloak brushing against his arm as she did. He shut the door behind her, the sound of the storm outside muffled by thick stone walls. Daenerys stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not speak right away, and John found himself watching her closely, watching the way her fingers flexed, the way her shoulders tensed beneath her cloak. Here, in the dim candlelight of his chambers, she looked almost uncertain. "I know you've been avoiding me," she said at last, turning to face him. John's jaw tensed. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair before he answered. "I've been busy." "So have I," she replied, her voice softer now. "And yet, I still see you. Across the hall, in the courtyard, in council meetings. I see you looking, and then I see you turning away." She tilted her head, searching his face. "Why?" John swallowed. He had prepared himself for battle, for blood and death and the cold inevitability of war. But this was different. "I don't know what you mean, Your Grace," he said, the lie sitting heavy on his tongue. Her lips pressed together in a faint, knowing smile. "Liar." John huffed a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "I never wanted any of this," he admitted. "Not the command, not the war, not any of it." She stepped closer. "And yet here you are." He looked at her then, really looked at her. Her violet eyes shone with something unreadable, something searching, just as conflicted as he felt. He had spent days trying to distance himself, to push her away before the truth between them destroyed what little peace they had left. But standing here now, so close he could feel the warmth of her, it felt impossible to ignore the pull between them. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. She hesitated. Then, in a near whisper, she said, "Because I don't want to be alone tonight." John let out a slow breath, his chest tight. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the space between them thick with unspoken words. He could have reached for her. He wanted to. 7 hells, he wanted to. But a part of him still clung to reason, to restraint. She must have sensed it, because after a moment, she stepped back, not far, just enough. "I should go," she murmured. But she didn't move. And neither did he. John's throat felt dry. "Don't," he found himself saying before he could stop himself. Her eyes searched his, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, he let himself look at her without turning away. Without pretending. The walls he had built between them had begun to crack. And by tomorrow, he knew they would shatter completely. because he could not keep the truth from her any longer. Chapter 70, Daenerys 3. Chapter text. Daenerys 3. As they walked through the quiet corridors of Winterfell, Daenerys found herself studying Jon's back, the way his shoulders tensed as if bracing against something unseen. The castle was silent, most had taken what little opportunity they had for sleep, knowing soon there would be none. The torches on the walls flickered weakly, casting long shadows as they moved. Jon led her towards the front doors, and the moment he pushed against them, the storm howled in greeting. He struggled against the weight of the wind, forcing the doors open just wide enough for them to slip through. The cold hit her immediately, sharp and biting against her skin. She hadn't stepped outside since the blizzard began, and now, as she took in the sight before her, she was momentarily breathless. The world was unrecognizable, where once the ground had been dark and familiar, now a thick blanket of white covered every surface. The air was heavy with snow, a misty veil obscuring the horizon, swallowing the castle walls and the distant trees beyond. It was beautiful, in a cruel, unforgiving way. Jon glanced at her and, without a word, unfastened his cloak, extending it in front of her as a shield against the wind. His body was close, his warmth pressed against her side as they moved. She did not resist. They walked like this, the two of them bound together against the storm. He, her protector, his arm a steady barrier between her and the ruthless cold. The wind howled around them, but beneath the weight of his cloak, she felt safe. At last, they reached the entrance to the crypts. Jon fought against the wind to push open the heavy wooden doors, and as soon as they stepped inside, the world changed. The blizzard was shut out in an instant, replaced by thick, muffled silence. The air was cool, but nothing compared to the merciless cold outside. Jon took a torch from the wall, the fire casting flickering light across his face as he turned to her. "Come," he said, his voice low, steady. She followed without hesitation, deeper into the dark, into the heart of Winterfell's dead. The flickering torchlight cast long, wavering shadows along the stone walls as Jon led Daenerys deeper into the crypts. The air was cool and damp, thick with the scent of earth and age. The walls whispered of history, of lives lived and lost, of kings and lords whose bones lay undisturbed beneath their feet. Daenerys had never feared the dead, but there was something different about this place. It was not the eerie, hollow stillness of Valyria, nor the silent, frozen graves of the Dothraki who refused to be buried. This was something else. Something heavier. Jon walked ahead of her, the torch in his hand illuminating the stone faces of the Stark ancestors carved into their tombs. She recognized some of the names: Eddard Stark, Rickard Stark. The men who had shaped the North into what it was. Then they reached the far end of the crypt, where a solitary statue stood apart from the rest. A woman, her hands clasped at her front, her face carved with quiet sorrow. A direwolf at her feet. Lyanna Stark. Jon stopped before the statue, the firelight flickering against his solemn expression. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring up at her. Jon exhaled slowly, finally breaking the silence. "What do you know of her?" Daenerys frowned slightly, unsure of where he was going with this. "She was your aunt. Ned Stark's sister." Jon's jaw tightened. "She was promised to Robert Baratheon," Daenerys continued carefully, "but Rhaegar saw her at the tourney at Harrenhal and he took her. He kidnapped her and brought her to Dorne. Your father and Robert started a rebellion against my father and brother to bring her home." Jon gave a slow nod. "And when the war was won, my father rode to find her." His voice grew quieter, rougher. "But she was already dead." A heavy silence settled between them. Daenerys glanced at him, her brow furrowed. She had known Jon for long enough now to sense when something was troubling him, but tonight, there was something deeper in his expression, something heavier. "I don't understand," she admitted. "Why are we here?" Jon didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes lingered on Lyanna's carved face, his hand tightening into a fist at his side. Then, after a moment, he turned to her. "What do you know of your brother?" The question caught her off guard. "Jon," she hesitated. "It's not a trick," he assured her. "Apart from this, what do people say about him?" Daenerys shifted, glancing away. "They say he was a good man. A skilled warrior. A devoted father. They say he loved music, poetry, art. That he was thoughtful, that he cared for his people. And, she trailed off. Jon stepped closer. And Daenerys exhaled. And that he would have been a great king. She felt a weight in her chest as she said it, knowing that the stories of Rhaegar Targaryen were colored by the different sides that had told them. To some, he was a villain, a cruel and reckless prince who had stolen a woman and left a kingdom in ruin. To others, he was the last great dragon, the hope of House Targaryen. Jon studied her closely. Do you think he, this man, this poet, this would-be king, would really have abducted a teenage girl against her will? Daenerys hesitated, the firelight flickering in her violet eyes. I don't know, Jon. She swallowed. I never knew him. Jon's voice was low, steady. I do, I know. She frowned, tilting her head slightly. What are you saying? His throat bobbed as he swallowed. They met at the tourney, that much is true. But she wasn't taken, Daenerys. He turned fully to face her now, his expression unreadable. She loved him. She went willingly. Daenerys felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. That's not possible, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Jon held her gaze. It is. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. The crypt suddenly felt smaller, the air thinner, as though the weight of the dead pressed down on her. Jon, her voice was barely above a whisper. What are you trying to tell me? He didn't answer straight away. His lips parted, then closed again as if he was struggling to force the words out. She could see it in his eyes, the war within him, the battle between duty and truth. She had seen Jon Snow hesitant before, quiet and brooding, but this was different. This was something deeper, something raw. They couldn't be together publicly, he said at last, his voice thick, not while Rhaegar was still married to Elia Martell. So he took Lyanna to the Tower of Joy until he could end his marriage and take her as his wife. Daenerys blinked. His wife. Jon gave a slow nod. They married in secret. She was with child when Rhaegar rode to the Trident. Daenerys felt the flicker of a shiver crawl down her spine. A child. A child, she echoed. A son, Jon said, his voice quiet, heavy. Born after Rhaegar was killed by Robert Baratheon. Her heartbeat quickened. A son of Rhaegar. A son who would have been ahead of her in the line of succession, a son whose claim would be greater than hers. She named him Jaehaerys, Jon continued. And then she died. She died in childbirth, Dany. Daenerys took another step back, shaking her head. Where is the child now? She asked, barely aware of her own voice. Her mind spun, calculating, if the child had lived, if he had been hidden away, he would be a threat. Rhaegar was the heir before Viserys before her. That meant his son would be the rightful heir before her. Jon's expression darkened. When my father arrived at the tower, there was no saving Lyanna. His throat worked as he swallowed, his fists clenching at his sides. But they gave him the child. No, the word slipped from her lips before she even realized she'd spoken it. Jon looked at her then, truly looked at her, and she felt her stomach drop. And he brought him home with him, Jon said. Daenerys took a step forward, her hands trembling. Jon, she whispered, as if pleading. Jon's jaw tightened. And he gave him the name Snow and called him his son. The world around her seemed to sway. The crypt, the statues, the flickering torches, all of it blurred, unsteady. Jon Snow wasn't a Stark bastard. He was a Targaryen. He was her blood. He was the heir to the Iron Throne. Daenerys stared at him, unblinking, her breath shallow and uneven. The torches cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the stark truth in his features. How had she never seen it before? The dark hair, the sharp lines of his face, so much Stark, but something else, too. Something older. Something hers. She took another step back, putting distance between them as if that could change what had just been said. You are the last person I expected to take my throne from me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jon's expression tightened. I don't want the throne. Daenerys let out a short, breathless laugh. No, she asked, arching a brow. Then why tell me this? Why now? Because it's the truth, Jon said simply. Because you deserve to know. She searched his face for any sign of falsehood, but all she found was sincerity, that infuriating honesty that had drawn her to him in the first place. I never wanted to be a king, he continued, stepping towards her now, closing the distance she had tried to create. I never wanted any of this, Dany. I swear myself to you. That will not change. She wanted to believe him. Gods, she wanted to believe him. But the truth was a dangerous thing. The North followed him, respected him. He may not want the throne, but power had a way of choosing its own kings. You are the last living male Targaryen, she said, her voice steadier now. You have the strongest claim. Do you really think they'll let you walk away from it? That they'll let me sit the throne with you alive? Jon clenched his jaw, shaking his head.